Chapter 230. At this moment, Wei Yuran looked at Yunjing City, which was like a huge monster lurking in the dark, with the mighty seniors of the Wei family. He looked terrible. This time he came to Dahan country, he underestimated the attraction of the full moon and heartstrings and the people in the world. The people of the Lianxia cult were scattered all the way. The more he chased them, the more they were scattered. All he caught were some useless corpse puppets. In addition, various forces fought and harassed him on the way. In the end, he even lost Dao Zisang's team. That was not the most embarrassing thing. The most annoying thing was that when he just reorganized his men to determine the direction of Dao Zisang and others' escape, the spy actually came to report that the full moon and heartstrings was not with Dao Zisang. It was sent to a safe place by another elder. The spy also said that a large number of people of the Enmore cult chased them outside the city. Wei Yuran, who had been holding his breath, was so angry that he couldn't bear it anymore. Regardless of the advice of the elders of the Wei family, he directly led his men back, hoping to catch up with the Enmore cult. Although the elders of the Wei family felt that it was quite inappropriate to fight against the Enmore cult, they couldn't boost the morale of the Enmore cult. Anyway, they were seniors of the inborn ninth hurdle. Even if they couldn't defeat the Enmore cult, it should not be a problem for them to escape with the second master and the miss. Therefore, there was the scene on the official road. Second master, don't be too anxious. The news just came. We can catch up if we rush there now. The 10th elder of the Wei family spoke. He was also the one with the highest cultivation. He was at the peak of the inborn realm. He used the poisonous insect perfectly. Wei Yuran was the most outstanding prince in the royal family of the Wei family. He was expected to be the new emperor of Nanjiang country in the future. His attitude was very modest. Suddenly, the 10th elder smelled a strange fragrance. Even he felt a little dizzy. His expression immediately changed and he shouted, "Everyone, hold your breath." The 10th elder's voice was still a little slow. When he spoke, several people fell to the ground. The 10th elder snorted coldly and waved his sleeves to disperse the fragrance around him. Wei Yuran and Wei Zhenzhen were always under the protection of the 10th elder. They took a breath proudly and took out the detoxification pill to swallow. Then, they became sober. Before Wei Yuran could figure out what was going on, several sword rays lit up in the darkness. A few warriors at Xiantian Realm Level 1 were caught off guard and were sliced in half from top to bottom. The smell of blood filled the air. Wei Yuran was so angry that his eyes almost popped out. He shouted, "Defend!" Those who could stand here were all experienced and experienced. As soon as Wei Yuran finished his words, the defensive tactical matrix was about to be formed. But this was a killing trap carefully arranged by Ling Li. How could it let the Wei family take a breather? Ling Liu's face under the mask was full of killing intent. He aimed at several key formation eyes, and the saber light in his hand shone brightly. Several heads fell to the ground and blood gushed out. The defensive formation suddenly collapsed. "Bastard, die!" When 10th elder saw Ling Liu, he was furious. He madly ran his vigorous zhenqi and raised his palm to attack Ling Liu. Ling Liu smoothly dodged the attack and jumped in the crowd. Unexpectedly, he disappeared from people's sight. Even the soul sense could not detect him for a while. Damn it! Blue veins popped on the 10th elder's forehead. His nerves were taut, and his spiritual sense constantly swept around. How could he not see such a strange hiding method? The people who attacked them were all killers who were proficient in assassination method. Ah! At this moment, a scream of horror suddenly came from behind 10th elder. It was the 6th miss. Oh no! His face suddenly changed, and he immediately turned back to defend, regardless of the fact that several disciples of the Wei family were killed. But it was still too late. A sharp dagger penetrated Wei Yuran's chest from the back to the chest and cut off the heart vein. A lot of blood gushed out of Wei Yuran's mouth. It seemed that he could not survive. "Master!" 10th elder cried desperately and rushed to Wei Yuran. He took over Wei Yuran's fallen body and only saw a pair of chilling eyes slowly disappear in the darkness. It was an extremely brilliant assassination skill, but he did not notice it at all. Second brother, Don't scare me. Wei Zhenjin's face was covered with Wei Yuran's blood. She was no longer barbaric and charming. Her beautiful eyes were full of panic. She grasped Wei Yuran's hands tightly and burst into tears. She said, "Second brother, you will be fine. We will go back and invite the best doctor. You must hold on." Wei Yuran could not speak at this moment. He held his breath and stared at Wei Yuran. Then he grabbed Wei Zhenjin's wrist and pulled her to him. Wei Zhenjin immediately understood. She leaned over and listened carefully. Finally, she heard intermittent sounds. Blood. Melting skill, revenge, refining. Before he finished his words, Wei Zhenjin could not hear anything else. Wei Yuran's hands had been loosened. Second brother. Wei Zhenjin's shrill cry echoed in the air. She lay on Wei Yuran's chest and did not want to raise her head. She remembered that in Nanjiang country, the emperor told her the news of the full moon and heartstrings. She pestered the second brother to take her to the Dahan country to participate in the auction. The second brother did not say anything and went to the emperor to ask for permission to set foot in a dangerous place. She was very happy and looked forward to a foreign country. But now, she hoped that she did not get the news and did not beg the second brother to come with her. It would be great if all this was fake. Sixth miss, we have to leave quickly. It is hard to guard against killers. The second master has been killed. You have to cheer up. 10th elder sighed. Wei Zhenjin slowly raised her head and revealed a pair of red and swollen eyes. They seemed to be stained with blood and were full of hatred. Well, let's go back immediately. We can't let the second brother's soul find the way home. Wei Zhenjin's tears had not dried up. She held Wei Yuran who had died. She stood up expressionlessly and looked down at Wei Yuran who seemed to be sleeping quietly in her arms. She said softly, "Second brother, I won't let you die with everlasting regret." After making up his mind, 10th elder immediately took people to leave. Later, Ling Mo attacked several times. He pretended that the assassination failed and escaped thousands of miles away. 10th elder was extremely angry, but he was afraid that it was a trick of luring the tiger away from the mountain. So, he did not dare to leave Wei Zhenjin. The sky gradually lit up. The darkness faded and the traces of killers also disappeared. 10th elder breathed a sigh of relief. Without the harassment of killers, he immediately sped up and returned to the country. When they came, there were hundreds of people, but when they left, there were only 20 or 30 people left. It could be said that they suffered a heavy loss. At this moment, in the barren mountain hundreds of miles north of Yunjing City, the battle between Dao Zisang and the Hehuan sect also came to an end. Hua Rui grabbed the double daggers backhandedly, half squatting, and looked at the elders of the Lianxia cult who also stopped opposite with gloomy eyes. Maybe God played a joke on the Hehuan sect. The route Hua Rui took people to escape happened to run into Dao Zisang and others. Then, he saw that Dao Zisang's eyes suddenly became blood red. Without saying a word, he fought with people of the Hehuan sect. Several people of the Hehuan sect died immediately. Hua Rui immediately got angry and started to fight back. Then, the two sides fought inexplicably. After a night, both sides fought with blood like a river. Hua Rui fought with 4 grand elders alone and pulled the one-sided battle into a stalemate. But he also paid the price of being seriously injured and exhausted. At this moment, although the Lianxia cult was deterred and did not dare to go forward, he knew his pain. Chulu, what the hell is going on? Why is the Lianxia cult the enemy of the Hehuan sect? Hua Rui had time to question Chulu. Chulu trembled like a frightened deer. Of course, she knew it was the result of Mr. Li's plan. But if she said it, she would die immediately. Maybe it was because her cultivation was too low that people of the Lianxia cult didn't take her seriously. Many seniors of the inborn realm died, but she was still alive. She took a deep breath and transmitted the sound, "Deputy Hierarch, it's like this." On a rainy night in the Wu family, Elder Dao was also attacked by the Lianxia cult and lost an arm. Chulu's tone was not accurate, but it was more convincing to Hua Rui. Elder Dao and the Lianxia cult had a grudge against each other, but he was the scapegoat. It was ridiculous. "Elder Dao, if you have resentment in your heart, you can go to the old guy, Dao Kong. Why do you make life difficult for me? Hua Rui's words were equivalent to admitting that it was the He sect that attacked on that rainy night. Dao Zisang remembered that the people who died on that day were all his subordinates who had followed him for more than 10 years. He was more resentful and said gloomily, Hua Rui, it's easy for you to say that. Since it's a grudge of life and death, how can I let you go alive? Dao Kong is a member of the He sect. I kill you to collect debts for my brothers. Hua Rui heard it and scolded Dao Kong in his heart. But he pretended to fight desperately. The 4 elders of the Lianxia cult were immediately shocked. They were alert to Hua Rui. The counterattack of a senior at the peak of the inborn realm was very horrible. As long as he was willing to give up his life, 2 people on their side would die. Hua Rui gathered momentum under his feet and became more and more horrible. No one wanted to be the 2 unlucky guys. The 4 people subconsciously retreated. But at this moment, Hua Rui fled back without saying anything. Then he disappeared in the barren mountain and rocks in the blink of an eye. The 4 people were instantly dumbfounded. They didn't expect that Hua Rui was so shameless that he directly betrayed other people of the He sect. Damn it. Chase him. He is seriously injured. He can't escape. Stop right there. The 4 elders were so angry that they chased him with Dao Zisang. The remaining 4 elders of the He sect saw that the deputy hierarch escaped. They didn't care about other people's life and death. They directly turned around and ran. But before they ran a few steps, they were shot in the neck by a stone flying from the barren mountain. They fell to the ground and died. The rest people, whether from the He sect or the Lianxia cult, were all frightened. Even the person didn't show up, but he directly killed 4 warriors of the upper inborn realm. The person was absolutely extremely horrible. Run. Under the pressure of life and death, the elders of the Lianxia cult wanted to run in the opposite direction of the stone. But this time, they were greeted by stone needles that were sharper than the stone. Ho! The elders of the Lianxia cult roared at the same time. Their ruddy faces became as grey as the stone. Their defensive power increased greatly. But the stone needles penetrated the spiritual shields of the 4 people but disappeared. They went through their heads with white brains. Plop! The corpses fell to the ground neatly. The 4 elders followed the footsteps of the He sect. But the person in the dark was not satisfied. He snorted coldly, and the stones shrouded them like flying rain. Ah. Chapter 231. After a short scream, there was no one alive except for Chu Lu in the barren hills and rocks which were like a slaughterhouse. Tick. Chu Lu's eyes were full of dullness after the fear. She felt that there was a drop of water falling on her face. She touched her face blankly, but her hands were blood red. She couldn't help but look up. It turned out that the blood was splashed on the stone and converged into a stream. It fell down along the tip like a blood rain. Chu Lu trembled and muttered to herself. She looked at the direction where the flying stone was shot. She had already guessed who did it, but she couldn't help but ask. Fang Yuan's lonely figure walked out of the forest. A ray of sunshine shone on his face, which covered up his paleness. It was not easy for him to use the AO sword skills on a large scale. His strength was not strong enough. Looking at the direction where the stone needles flew out, Fang Yuan's eyes flashed a touch of warmth. He walked to Chu Lu, who was absent-minded, and said indifferently, "Thank you for this period of time. The Leanly building has fulfilled half of the promise. Go back to the Leanly building with me. After Mr. Li detoxifies you, you will be free." Hearing that, Chu Lu couldn't help but tremble. She was scared and excited. Finally, she seemed to collapse. She squatted down and cried. She was afraid of the cruel means of the Leanly building. A young warrior like Fang Yuan was indifferent when he killed people. It seemed that what he killed was not people, but melons and vegetables. From Fang Yuan's face, she seemed to see the mountains of corpses and seas of blood behind the Leanly building. It was as frightening as the He sect. She was excited because although the Leanly building was an evil force like the He sect, it was more trustworthy than the He sect. It really helped her to wipe out the forces of the Hehuan sect in Yunjing and invited her to stay in the Linli building to detoxify. Such a polite invitation made her realize that she was still a person who could be respected. When Chu Lu was crying, Chu Qingning and Fang Mu came together, holding the heads of the other 4 elders of the Lianxia cult in their hands. At this moment, the 2 of them were a little upset. They made a sneak attack just now, but they almost let them escape. If Su Li didn't help them secretly, their plan would fail. What's the situation? Fang Yuan took the head and put all the corpses together to destroy the corpses and asked. Chu Qingning said with a smile, Hua Rui ran in a funny way. He thought that he had escaped from the eyes and ears of the 4 people. Now he is on the way back. Big brother, let me help. Fang Mu diligently moved the corpse and poured the powder to remove the blood. Fang Yuan nodded and said nothing. Chu Lu saw the 4 heads and the 3 people's actions of destroying the corpses. She was shocked and gradually stopped crying. She had always been smart. At this moment, how could she figure out the intention of Fang Yuan and others? Sigh. Chu Lu suddenly sympathized with the Hehuan sect and the Lianxia cult. They were both 9th grade sects and minded their own business. However, Mr. Li made things difficult for them and they became mortal enemies. It could be imagined that when Hua Rui returned to the sect and told Yi Tian the news of the annihilation of the Lianxia cult, the conflict between the Hehuan sect and the Lianxia cult would inevitably be irreconcilable. 1 hour later, Chu Lu, who had become an ordinary woman, followed Fang Yuan and others back to the Linli building. Yin Xuetong had already arranged for her and took her to the room on the 4th floor. Chu Lu sat on the bed and looked around at the layout of the room. Different from the colorful colors of the Hongyang house, the color here was cyan. It exuded a simple and elegant atmosphere, as if there was a breeze blowing on the face, which made people feel comfortable. This was not the first time that she came to the Linli building, but only this time made her feel at ease. Because she finally didn't need to be a pawn of the Hehuan sect. After the Hongchen powder was removed, she could inquire about the whereabouts of her brother. Miss Chu, Mr. Li asked you to go to the attic on the top floor to find him. Fang Mu's voice sounded outside the door. Chu Lu had seen him before. He was a young man less than 20 years old. He looked very shy. But after today's experience, she no longer dared to look down on anyone in the Linli building. I see. I'm coming. Chu Lu had no clothes to change now. She could only take off the coat stained with a lot of blood. She tidied her hair and opened the door. But she saw Fang Ling's sister Chu. Where are you going? I bring you clean clothes. There is a bathhouse on the 1st floor. There is no one there. You can take a bath. Looking at Fang Ling's clean eyes, Chu Lu smiled uncomfortably and said, Mr. Li asked me to go there. Oh. Fang Ling suddenly understood. She held the clothes and walked into the room. She said, then I will put the clothes in your room. You can change them when you come back. Putting down the clothes, Fang Ling skipped away. Chu Lu couldn't help but wonder why the servants here didn't seem to be in awe of Mr. Li. Well, it has nothing to do with me in the future. Chu Lu shook her head and went upstairs. She pushed the door open and saw a young man in cyan sitting by the window reading. She subconsciously looked uncomfortable. She walked to Su Li with light steps and said respectfully, Mr. Li, are you looking for me? Seeing Chu Lu's attitude, Su Li's eyes flashed. She smiled and said, Miss Chu, we just cooperate. Now the cooperation is over. Don't be so formal. Yes, Mr. Li. Chu Lu nodded and smiled bitterly in her heart. Now the name Mr. Li was not as unknown as before. He was a famous and unfathomable big shot in the capital. She had seen the cruel means of the Linli building. How could she be at ease at this moment? Su Li smiled slightly and pushed a glass of wine to Chu Lu. After drinking 3 glasses, Chu Lu gradually relaxed. She found that Mr. Li was very kind and easy to get along with. What's your plan after detoxification? Su Li put down the wine glass and asked innocently. Chu Lu thought of the little things in these years. She felt bitter in her heart. Facing Su Li, she had the idea of spitting it out. Su Li was a very suitable person to talk to. With Mr. Li's vision, he might be able to help her. But it might be Mr. Li's trap to make her fall into entanglement again. Chu Lu was silent and didn't answer for a long time. Su Li was not in a hurry. She drank slowly and waited. She was very clear about Chu Lu's wisdom. Otherwise, she wouldn't have survived from the harsh conditions of the Hehuan sect until today. After a quarter of an hour, Chu Lu's sad eyes became clear again. She smiled at Su Li and pleaded, "What can I do? I will not return for 10 years. Now things are the same, but people have changed. I just want to find my only relative. I don't have the face to see him. If I can see him from afar, I will die without regret. Mr. Li, are you willing to help me?" Chapter 232. Chu Lu lowered her head and said without hesitation, "I have been under the control of the Hehuan sect for 10 years. Now, except for the Hongyang house, there is no other valuable thing. If you want, I am willing to cooperate and hand over the intelligence system of the Hongyang house to you." Su Li was waiting for her words. She nodded slightly and said, "You and Yin Xuetong can handle it. In return, I can help you to inquire about the whereabouts of your brother." Chu Lu nodded gently and smiled with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Li." In fact, she was afraid that Mr. Li would force her to stay like the Hehuan sect. Fortunately, he didn't mention it. Now that she could find out the whereabouts of her brother at the Hongyang house, it was the best result. She also thought that after the Hehuan sect retreated, she could control the intelligence system of the Hongyang house by herself. But an intelligence system without strength was like building an attic on a pile of sand. It couldn't stand up at all. She was afraid that the Hongyang house would be destroyed by the people of the Enmore cult on the second day after she took control. Such an unrealistic idea only flashed in her mind once and was rejected by her. Su Li nodded and asked Chu Lu to leave. She had thought of letting Chu Lu stay, but Chu Lu obviously had a shadow about the power of the Hehuan sect. She was eager to be free. It was not appropriate to talk with her now. It was not too late to ask Chu Lu's opinion after she accepted the Hongyang house. Chu Lu stood up and saluted. She turned around and was about to leave. Suddenly, she stopped and turned back. She said, "I have been separated from my brother for more than 10 years. You are still young. I am afraid that you don't know. But you are always experienced and knowledgeable. I still want to ask one more question." Su Li's eyes flashed and her tone softened. "Go ahead. I have agreed to make a deal with you. It is okay for you to ask one more question. Do you know that the Yi family was destroyed 14 years ago?" Chu Lu's words shocked Su Li slightly. She subconsciously thought of Ling Qinglan. Chu Lu's eyes were slightly moist. She said to herself, "I used to be the adopted daughter of the Yi family. That year, I went to other places to find my biological parents under the care of the guards of the Yi family. When I came back, I found that the Yi family was destroyed. I asked around and only heard that my brother was still alive. But before I had time to find him, he was captured by the Hehuan sect." "What is your brother's name?" Su Li's eyes were shining. Chu Lu's expression changed. She gritted her teeth and said, "My real name is Yi Shui. My brother is the eldest son of the Yi family. My brother is the eldest son of the Yi Mo." Su Li thought for a moment, but she didn't tell Chu Lu the clue. If Ling Qinglan was not Yi Mo, wouldn't she make Chu Lu happy in vain? "I see. I will ask people of the Linli building to inquire about it. Just wait for the news." Hearing that, Chu Lu was disappointed, but she cheered up soon. She had been looking for her brother secretly for 10 years, but there was no news. It would be strange if Mr. Li really knew it. However, in her heart, Mr. Li had always been resourceful. Maybe there would be news soon. She had waited for so many years. She would soon be free from the Hongchen powder. She could wait for another 10 years. After Chu Lu left, Yin Xuetong knocked on the door excitedly with the account book. He said, "Su Li, since we auctioned the bottle of Liehua spirits at the auction house, the orders have increased sharply. We made 80 million taels this morning. Under the operation of the machine, there was a large amount of raw Liehua spirits in the cellar." But Yin Xuetong learned from Su Li in business. He told the businessman that it was extremely difficult to brew the raw Liehua spirits, and only 8 jars could be brewed in 3 months. In this way, all the businessmen immediately rushed to bid. Finally, the price was 10 million taels, which was not much lower than the price at the auction house. Su Li saw Yin Shuetong's eyes were shining like a miser. She couldn't help but laugh. She said, "Silver is only useful in the secular world. Chu Lu has promised to give us the intelligence of the Hongyang house. You can take the money to reorganize the intelligence system. It is more than enough." Yin Shuetong was slightly startled when she heard this, and then nodded solemnly. The intelligence system of a force was equivalent to the eyes of this force, and it was a very important institutional composition. Although the intelligence system of the Red Rouge House was very perfect, the people inside needed to be replaced, and naturally needed a lot of money to operate. It turned out that Su Li auctioned the Liehua spirits for this purpose. Yin Shuetong was enlightened. She secretly stuck out her tongue. Su Li's plan was closely linked and precise. She deserved to be the amazing woman she admired. By the way, what happened to the people of the Dongfang family? Su Li rubbed her eyebrows and suddenly asked. Yin Shuetong was a little strange. She nodded and replied, "They all woke up and left before dawn." What did you do to them?" She clearly remembered that before the group of people was locked in the adytum, they would rather die than surrender. They were all loyal guards of the Dongfang family. But less than an hour after Su Li went in, the attitude of the group of people changed completely. Their eyes were full of fanatical belief. They even called her Protector Yin when they saw her. Su Li's means were really terrible. Su Li took a sip of the wine and supported half of her cheek with her right hand. She looked indifferent. "I didn't do anything. I just changed something a little bit." Yin Shuetong didn't understand. This matter involved Su Li's means, so she didn't dare to ask more. She could only go to work. At this moment, the Enmore cult, who had already returned home, also received the news that the people of the Dongfang family had left the Linli building safely. He frowned and muttered to himself, "Mr. Li, what do you want to do?" Ling Qinglan looked at the bright light in the sky, and there was doubt in his eyes. "But he always believed in Mr. Li. Mr. Li has been showing kindness to us all the time. I believe that he must have his intention to do this time. But we lack information and can't understand it. There is another news." Ling Mo walked into the yard from outside. He looked tired, but his eyes were shining. He said, "The Hehuan sect and the Lianxia cult fought on the barren mountain in the north of the city. Both sides were injured. Only Hua Rui escaped. The others didn't kill each other, but were killed by an unknown force. The scene was cleaned up, and no corpses were found." Ling Li and Ling Qinglan were both shocked. Ling Li rubbed his chin, and there was an evil smile on his face, which was very inconsistent with his playboy dress. He said, "It seems that when we were dealing with the Wei family, the Linli building was not idle. In the entire Yunjing city, only the Dongfang family and the Linli building had the ability to do this except for the Enmore cult. The people sent by the Dongfang family were all arrested by the Linli building. There was no need to guess who did this. Mr. Li, you have good means." Ling Qinglan figured out the reason, and his eyes were shining. He said, "In this way, there will be a chaotic battle between the Hehuan sect, the Lianxia cult and the Wei family of the Nanjiang country. Yes. Although they have suffered heavy losses in the auction fair, there must be someone who can't bear it. As long as one person takes action, things will be easy." When Ling Li said this, his eyes fell on Ling Mo. Ling Mo twitched his mouth and nodded expressionlessly. He said, "Master, I know what to do." Ling Qinglan chuckled and said, "You are the head of the Shuelo cult. This kind of shameful dirty work naturally falls on you." Then, there came the evil laughter of 2 men in the yard. Ling Mo was depressed. He had to go out to do something soon after he returned to Yunjing City. Ling Qinglan touched his nose and looked at Ling Li with a faint smile. He said, "I remember that last time you told my aunt that Ling Mo helped you collect beauties in the world and was almost spanked. What's the reason this time? How dare you mention it?" Ling Li's face immediately darkened. He said, "If you didn't think of such an unreliable reason to tell my mother, would I be chased and beaten all over the yard? This time, just say." Ling Li scratched his head and was full of distress. Compared with dealing with his mother, he preferred to go out and fight with the head of the Lianxia cult. When he thought that Qiu Meng was going to ask the usual questions, he felt a headache. Master, just say that you like antiques recently. How about asking Ling Mo to help you inquire about it? Ling Xian, who had been silent, suddenly proposed. Ling Li's eyes lit up and he said with a smile, okay, just say this. Ling Mo, you set off immediately. Ling Mo, who was calm, couldn't help but sigh at this moment. Master also had times of fear. Everything had its vanquisher. At this moment, in the imperial garden of the imperial palace, the middle-aged man in black bowed his head and followed Dongfang Xiao. He said respectfully, Master, there are many forces in this auction and I did gain a lot. The Lianxia cult was divided into 4 groups. Although they lost a lot of people, they kept the full moon and heartstrings. The person from the Hehuan sect is Hua Rui, the deputy hierarch. He came empty-handed and is probably on the way back to the sect now. Dongfang Xiao stretched out his hand to pick a wintersweet. He opened his eyes slightly and seemed to appreciate the beautiful figure of the wintersweet. He said slowly, is there any news from the Enmore cult? Yes. The middle-aged man in black said firmly. Dongfang Xiao was interested. He turned around and stared at the middle-aged man. Say it. The Enmore cult is still as secretive as usual. But this time, they met with the Hehuan sect and took action. But the middle-aged man in black said with pity, Child Li, who wore a jadebone mask, didn't take action. I only saw someone from the Enmore cult took action and instantly restrained a warrior at the peak of the inborn realm. His cultivation is really terrible. I was afraid that I would be exposed and couldn't come back to report the news, so I had to hide far away. Later, I didn't see anyone from the Enmore cult when I went there. It seemed that they just came to declare the sovereignty of Yunjing City. They didn't do anything radical. Dongfang He, you really cherish your life. Dongfang Xiao laughed in a low voice. The middle-aged man in black immediately showed a look of fear. He hurriedly knelt down and said firmly, I dare not. I'm just afraid that I can't send the news back to the imperial palace. I'm not running away. Forget it. Get up. It's just a joke. You're scared. Dongfang Xiao waved his hand and felt bored. But his eyes flashed with seriousness. Chapter 233. After that, Eunuch Feng gave him elixirs. Dongfang He knelt down and thanked him profusely. He left Dongfang Xiao alone in the imperial garden to meditate. Looking at the blooming plum blossoms in the yard, Dongfang Xiao looked gloomy. It was said that the Enmore cult suffered a disaster and withdrew from the spiritual circle. Its power was not strong enough. All the elders had to practice in isolation because of the lack of nimbus in the secular world. He tested it with the full moon and heartstrings. He was sure that the Enmore cult despised the full moon and heartstrings, but they would definitely emphasize their domineering power. But the result was not the same as the rumor. The Wanjian sect is really deceiving me. Dongfang Xiao walked back and forth with his hands behind his back. With the accumulation of the Dongfang family, they could have a place in the spiritual circle. However, the competition in the spiritual circle was too fierce. Why did the Dongfang family give up the stable life in the secular world and go to the spiritual circle to live a life in danger? This idea didn't change until the appearance of the Enmore cult. For many years, he couldn't find out where the Enmore cult was hiding near Yunjing. The Enmore cult was like a hidden dragon, cultivating in his territory. If it recovered one day, the Dongfang family would be the first nourishment it devoured. He had to take action first. Dongfang Xiao had always thought about this. He maintained the balance of power in Yunjing City and constantly tested the bottom line of the Enmore cult, but he never got anything. Just a few days ago, a group of warriors who claimed to be from the Wanjian sect in the spiritual circle came and arrogantly asked him to block the city to collect the defected disciples. But at that time, the auction fair was going on in Yunjing City. If he really blocked the city, he would offend all the forces in the martial arts circle. How could he afford it? But the people of the Wanjian sect were very domineering. They finally parted on bad terms with him and disappeared. But he got the news of the Enmore cult from them. But now it seemed that the Wanjian sect was really hateful and deliberately deceived him. Fortunately, he was careful and didn't be fooled. Lord He, congratulations. Dongfang He stepped into the courtyard with a happy face. Immediately, some people congratulated him. He smiled and nodded along the way, feeling proud. Some people were jealous, but they didn't dare to show it on their faces. This was the Loyalty Pavilion near the Eastern Third House. All the loyal death guards of the Dongfang family lived here. The Eastern Third House was where the princes lived after they grew up. Arranging the Loyalty Pavilion here was also to protect the princes. After all, the bloodline of the royal family was the most important. Back to his own yard, Dongfang He put down the reward he got from the emperor and took a deep breath. There was no glory in his eyes anymore, but a sense of fear. He was born in the Dongfang family. He was the descendant of the Dongfang family's servants. He had been cultivating hard all these years. When he was 70 years old, he finally stepped into the immortal level. His status rose and he was promoted to the commander of the Death Guards. He had almost 20 subordinates. But 70 years of deep-rooted memories told him that he actually had another identity, and that was a spy. I was the undercover of the Linli building, and so were all my subordinates. I sneaked into the Dongfang family to fight for a future for the Linli building. The Linli building was the force I was loyal to. The Dongfang family killed my parents, and I had an irreconcilable hatred. The Dongfang family was perverse and cruel. There were many spies like me, but for safety, we never contacted each other. Dongfang His eyes were full of enthusiasm and glory. It was the greatest glory of his life to work for the Linli building. After all, even the Enmore cult was only a small part of the Linli building. How could the Dongfang family, which was a small family, compare with such a giant? In another 2 or 3 years, the Linli building would replace the Dongfang family and become the new master of the Dahan country. At that time, I would be the hero who founded the country. Dongfang His eyes were full of expectation. He had been dormant for 70 years, and now there were only 2 or 3 years left. He would try his best to get credit in these 2 or 3 years, and fight for a reputation for himself. Mr. Li, I won't let you down. A low voice sounded in the room, and then it was silent. The elixir rewarded by Dongfang Xiao was extremely precious. He wanted to use it to break through to the longevity realm. It was really happy to use the enemy's elixir to break through and then revenge. People who came back with Dongfang He also got rewards. Without exception, they all thought that they were the undercover of the Linli building and had a great hatred with the Dongfang family. Then they practiced hard. Su Li disguised as Mr. Li and stood in front of the window of the Hongyang house. She listened to the screams behind her and looked at the imperial palace. Yes, she just made some slight adjustments to the memory of Dongfang He and others with the elixir. Most of their lives still started from the hard training in the imperial palace, but the starting point was erased by her and changed to loyalty to the Linli building. These people were trained as the death guards by the Dongfang family, and their minds were firm and unshakable. But after the memory was changed, their firm obsession became a gift for her. They were a group of the best undercover agents who didn't know how to rebel. If I had more time, a trace of pity flashed in Su Li's eyes. The elixir was a semi-finished product that she researched in her previous life. The side effect was too great. The price of taking the elixir was that their life would be shortened and they would die in 2 years at most. The cultivation of Dongfang He and others would advance by leaps and bounds in these 2 years. The elixir would make them crazy and they would burn their vitality to practice desperately. But when the elixir was exhausted, they would regain their memory and die. Well, I make the best use of them. The pity in Su Li's eyes faded, and she looked natural. She never knew what was called soft-hearted to the enemy. Mr. Li, the necessary cleaning has been completed. A person came forward and said respectfully. He looked at Su Li with the same fanaticism as Dongfang He. She was their king, the omnipotent god in their hearts. Their lives belonged to Mr. Li. Even if Mr. Li asked them to die immediately, they would do it without hesitation. Su Li waved her hand, and a gust of wind rose in front of the building, which faded the bloody smell in the room. She said, Take the rest of the people and leave. There is no need for the Hongyang house to exist. Yes, Mr. Li. After a short time, the red light alley was on fire. The Hongyang house no longer existed. Chu Lu had been missing for several days, which became a big regret in the hearts of many childs in Yunjing City. At the same time, on the famous tea house street in Yunjing City, an old tea house for transfer was hung with a plaque. Shuarong Tea House. The middle-aged woman, who used to be the procuress of the Hongyang house, changed her face at the moment. Her dress was simple and elegant, and her smile was not coquettish anymore. No one could know that she used to be the most powerful mother in the red light alley. Chapter 234. The new year was coming. The servants of the Ling mansion were busy cleaning the whole mansion. They were all old servants of the Ling mansion. Madam Dowager and Madam Dowager treated them very well and didn't treat them as servants. They were humble, so they were grateful and loved the Ling mansion like their own home. Chiu Meng was settling accounts in the room. There were too many industries to settle at the end of the year. She was almost busy from morning to night. Suddenly, there was a creak. The door was opened. Chiu Meng bit her pen and asked without raising her head, "Mammy, what's wrong? You can handle the cleaning of the Ling residence." No one answered outside. Chiu Meng frowned slightly and stopped writing. She looked back and saw the wheelchair and the legs covered by a blanket outside the door. "Li." She was slightly shocked and quickly put down the account and walked over. Ling Li, sitting in the wheelchair, came into her view gradually. At this moment, he was dressed neatly and didn't look like a playboy. He was full of smiles, but his eyes kept dodging. Seeing his expression, Chiu Meng suddenly became angry. She reached out to pull Ling Li's ear and said, "Boy, did you make trouble outside again?" Ling Li quickly shrank his head to avoid Chiu Meng's hand and said helplessly, No, Mother, I have something to ask you this time. I have been studying in the yard these days. I didn't make trouble." "Really?" Chiu Meng stopped and didn't believe it. This boy had a lot of tricks. He always said that he didn't make trouble, but she still had to clean up for him. "Really, it's more real than gold." Ling Li covered his head with his hands like an ostrich. His voice came from his clothes. In order to maintain the image of a playboy, he almost cheated a little every 3 days and a big one every 7 days, but his mother was cheated every time. Seeing her son's strange behavior, Chiu Meng covered her mouth and laughed. The mammies who were still busy in the yard couldn't help but smile. Someone secretly thought that if the little master's legs were good, the picture would be more perfect. "Well, I'll believe you again this time." Chiu Meng walked behind Ling Li and pushed the wheelchair into the room. Ling Li was still thinking about the door and looked at it eagerly. He said, "Mother, close the door. I'm afraid that someone will eavesdrop." Chiu Meng became more curious and turned around to close the door. "Well, what do you want to tell me? Why are you so mysterious?" It's nothing," Ling Li murmured and suddenly stuttered. Chiu Meng waited for a long time but didn't hear the words. When did this boy become so indecisive? Chiu Meng took a breath and sat down, waiting for Ling Li to pluck up the courage to speak. Since the disaster that year, Ling Li had become very rebellious. He usually avoided her and wanted to hang out with those playboys outside every day. Today, he suddenly came to talk to her alone without a servant. He must have something very important to tell her. She had to listen to it anyway. Ling Li thought. G Li's words. Yeah. Ling Li family Li, Is Ji Li Ling Li, you have lived 2 lives and experienced more hardships than anyone else. But now, for your marriage, you can't even show such courage. Are you a man? Ling Li had been muttering for an hour. Chiu Meng saw Ling Li struggling with himself. She pretended to sigh and said, "Li, if you don't tell me, I have to settle the account." Ling Li suddenly woke up. He was so anxious that he blurted out the words hidden in his heart. "Mother, please tell me how to please girls." Chiu Meng was stunned, and then her eyes were burning. She stood up excitedly and grasped Ling Li's shoulder tightly. She said, "Tell me, which girl do you like?" Ling Li blushed and pointed behind Chiu Meng. He wanted to change the topic. "Mother, the chair fell down, don't worry about that. Tell me, who do you like? That way, I can give you some advice. No one knew how excited Chiu Meng was at the moment. Finally, there was a son who wanted to get married. Ping was concerned about the military affairs. As the mistress of the Ling family, she had to take the overall situation into consideration. She couldn't urge him. Ling Li was useless, so he had been lingering in the brothel. She had lost the hope of holding a grandson. Unexpectedly, there was a turning point. God bless me. Chiu Meng quickly prayed for Buddha's blessing in her heart. She went to the temple every year in these years. Finally, it worked. She must go to the temple to fulfill her vows. Son, a prodigal who repents is more precious than gold. If you can change your temperament, no matter who you like, it will be easy for you to marry her with the help of the Ling family. Chiu Meng immediately seized the opportunity to instill Ling Li the idea of turning over a new leaf. Ling Li smiled bitterly in his heart. That person had known his true colors for a long time. But even so, she didn't show any affection. Sometimes, she hid far away from him and wanted to disassociate herself from him. But he was deeply involved in it and couldn't extricate himself. He endured it for a year and repeatedly told himself that he couldn't do that. But all his efforts disappeared with the gentle hug of Su Li at the auction. He couldn't tell Chiu Meng about this situation. After listening to her nagging for a long time, Ling Li said helplessly, "Mother, she is not that kind of person. What you said is useless. How did you fall in love with my father?" "Your father?" Chiu Meng's eyes flashed with warmth. She couldn't help but cover her mouth and chuckle when she thought of the things when she was young. She said, "He was a rude man. He didn't know anything about flowers. He directly broke into my family and knelt in front of my parents. He didn't want to leave." Ling Li was stunned. How could his father be so fierce? Chiu Meng recalled a lot, but the light in her eyes dimmed, and there was a trace of bitterness in her mouth. "Li, no matter what, you must cherish your life. Your mother, your grandmother, and your future wife will not want our cherished relatives to leave you. Do you understand?" The sadness spread unexpectedly. It was so strong that it infected Ling Li instantly. Ling Li couldn't help being moved. He understood his mother's pain, but he didn't know that his mother had been hiding all these in her heart. "I know, Mother. As long as the Enmore cult existed, the people of the Ling family would not be in danger. The revenge of my father, grandfather, and second uncle. One day, I will catch the murderer and offer his blood to their souls in heaven." At this moment, Ling Li's eyes flashed with coldness. "Well, don't talk about these sad things." Chiu Meng wiped her tears and quickly returned to her usual posture. She said, "You haven't told me which family she is from." Ling Li quickly restrained the coldness in his eyes and turned his head away in embarrassment. His voice was lower than that of a mosquito, but Chiu Meng still heard it clearly. "Mother, you have seen her." "I have seen her." Chiu Meng's expression was strange. She thought of countless girls from good families. She had seen more than hundreds of girls from aristocratic families. How could she think of Ling Li's words? Ling Li saw that Chiu Meng was confused. His face tightened, and he stammered, yes, you have seen her a few days ago, and we went to what?" Chiu Meng was anxious. Why did this silly boy take so long just to say the name? Suddenly, an idea flashed in her mind. She blurted out, "Is it Su Li? Su Li who went to the hunting ground with us?" Ling Li was silent. Chiu Meng's smile suddenly spread on her face. She said, "The first beauty in Yunjing. The first talented girl in Yunjing. Now she is Princess Li. My son really has a good taste. Mother, don't make fun of me." Ling Li sighed helplessly. There was still a blush on his face. He found that his idea of asking for advice from his mother was completely a joke. Chiu Meng nodded secretly. It seemed that her son was serious this time. If it were the other girls in the past, she would have been full of flattery and offended them. This time, he was shy when he said a name. But Chiu Meng frowned. Su Li. Su Li was the dream daughter-in-law of all the madams in Yunjing City. She was talented and beautiful. Besides, she was taught by Qi Xianqing and had excellent medical skills. Many people stared at her. If Lord Rui didn't stand in her way, Su Li would have been married. Ling Li was her son. In her eyes, he was a good son. But she also knew that Ling Li had a bad reputation. Although he had a good appearance, he was the first playboy in the world. Thinking of this, Chiu Meng was worried. It was impossible to rely on her son alone. She had to help him. If necessary, she must make Miss Su marry the Ling family willingly with the help of the whole family. Chiu Meng's expression became serious, which frightened Ling Li's son. I will find a way. You should study more these days. Don't go out and fool around with others. I will ask the tailor to make 2 more new clothes for you. Wait for my good news. Ling Li felt dizzy. He felt that the situation was out of control. Mother, what do you want to do? Don't worry about it. Since you like Su Li, I can't let her feel wronged. I'd better find her by myself. Mother, go back to study. On this day, Su Li was studying a new prescription in the room. Lord Rui's mansion sent a batch of precious elixirs. Many of them could be used. It seemed that the illusionary powder improved by her could continue to improve its effect. Thinking of this, Su Li suddenly remembered that Ling Li borrowed the illusionary powder from her identity as Mr. Li to deal with the Wei family last time. I forgot to ask Fang Yuan to get it. Su Li couldn't help rubbing her eyebrows. After the auction, there were more things to deal with. She was so busy that her practice time was reduced by half. The so-called reward was nothing but the corpses of the guards of the Wei family. Chapter 235. Miss, there is an invitation from the Ling mansion. Mammy Li came in with an envelope painted with hundreds of flowers. Su Li took it with a strange feeling. Ling Li contacted her so blatantly and used such a fancy envelope. What the hell was he doing? Su Li opened the envelope and saw that it was Chiu Meng. She suddenly understood. Little Su Li, the new year is coming. The plum blossoms in the Ling mansion are in full bloom. Aunt Meng made some new snacks. I always feel that something is missing, so I thought of you. Can you come to the Ling mansion to appreciate the plum blossoms? It turned out that Ling Li was not looking for her. Su Li was a little relieved. Her cooking and medical skills were very famous in Yunjing City. It was normal that Chiu Meng wanted to ask her for help. But at the end of the year, Chiu Meng should be very busy. How could she have time to make new snacks? Miss, the servants of the Ling mansion are still waiting outside. How can you answer? Mammy Li asked eagerly. She was old and had no children. She had long treated Su Li as her own daughter. Now what worried her most was Su Li's marriage. The Ling General's mansion and the Lord Rui's mansion were well matched. General Ling Ping was powerful and righteous, but there was no news that he was going to get married. Ling Li, the third master of the Ling family, was a playboy. Miss should not fall in love with him. Su Li looked up and saw that Mammy Li was murmuring something. She couldn't help but shake her head. She closed the envelope and gave it to her. She said, "Tell the people of the Ling mansion that I will go to the appointment of Madam on time and improve my cooking skills." Mammy Li saw the signature on the letter and couldn't help but smile. It turned out that she thought too much. In the Ling General's mansion, after Chiu Meng got Su Li's positive answer, she was excited. She grabbed the invitation and walked to the depth of the Ling General's mansion. There was a small Buddha hall in the backyard of the Ling mansion. In front of the Buddha, there were many memorial tablets of the people of the Ling family who died on the battlefield. After Ms. Jiyu retired from the court, she almost went to the Buddha hall every day to pray for a moment of inner peace. I have killed countless people in my life. I do not ask for a good end in this life, nor do I ask for good karma in the next life. I only ask that the descendants of the Ling family can receive the blessings of our ancestors and not be invaded by evil. Amitabha, the prayer beads in her hand rotated smoothly. Ms. Jiyu closed her eyes slightly and looked peaceful, as if she was integrated into the Buddha statue and became a quiet and peaceful Buddha. "Mother, are you inside?" Chiu Meng's voice came from outside the room. After Mrs. Jiyu finished the last sentence, she put down the Buddha beads in her hand, got up slowly, picked up her crutch, opened the door and walked out. Seeing Chiu Meng, she looked serious and asked in a calm tone, "Meng, you interrupted me while I was paying my respects to Buddha. I knew something big had happened, so I quickly came out. What happened? Mother, it's a good thing. Chiu Meng told the whole story of Ling Li and showed the invitation to Ms. Jiyu. Ms. Jiyu was silent for a long time. Suddenly, she smiled with her eyes narrowed into slits. Su Li is a good girl. Our Ling family can't treat her badly. Since Li is interested, let him pursue Su Li. If Su Li doesn't agree, we can't force him. Mother, you are right. But, Chiu Meng looked hesitant. Li finally has the thought of turning over a new leaf. Even so, we can't take advantage of the innocent girl. Ms. Gu's crutch shook the floor, and her turbid eyes were full of clarity as if she had seen through the world. She said, Meng I know you are anxious, and so am I. But this matter can't be rushed. Ms. Jiyu walked in the corridor with her crutch, and Chiu Meng held her arm to keep up with her. For several years, Ling Ping has been supporting the Ling family alone. He has sheltered us from wind and rain. Although Li has a leg disease, he is still a child of the Ling family. He should know what his responsibility is. If he only covets enjoyment and beauty under the protection of Ling Ping, then we can't hurt Su Li. This is the duty of a human being. Do you know? I can see that Li is serious this time. Chiu Meng couldn't help retorting, but Ms. Jiyu smiled. He is only 17 years old. What he has done most in the past 10 years is to take the little fatty of the Tang family to the brothel. If his father was still alive, he would have broken his legs. Chiu Meng didn't speak. Ms. Jiyu saw her face was a little pale, but she didn't point it out. She continued, young people are hot-headed, and they can't be taken seriously. Especially Ling Li is full of evil ideas. Our Ling family has been loyal for generations. If Ling Li can't promise Su Li, we can't be ashamed of this matter. But, speaking of this, Ms. Jiyu took the invitation from Chiu Meng's hand. She changed the topic and said with a smile, you act first and report later. Since Su Li wants to come, let's see if they are destined to be together. Chiu Meng slightly opened her beautiful eyes. You agree? When did I say no? A smile flashed in Ms. Gu's eyes, but this matter must be treated with caution. Whether the girl is the princess or not, it depends on her own will. Do you understand? I know. Chiu Meng nodded and looked at Ms. Jiyu eagerly. Ms. Jiyu shook her head and laughed. I am old. I am afraid that I can't even knead the dough when I cook. However, our Jiyu family's ancestors also ran a pastry shop, so the recipe is still here. Come with me to get it. Chiu Meng's eyes were slightly bright. She showed a little girl's temperament in front of Ms. Jiyu and said with a smile, the snack of the Jiyu family is my favorite when I was a child. Ms. Jiyu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. You little girl, the thing about Su Li hasn't been settled yet. Do you want her to make snacks for you? The shop of the Jiyu family is closed. I heard that Su Li is very good at cooking. If I give her the recipe of snacks, maybe I can still taste the taste of those years. You are the mother of 2 grown-up sons. Aren't you afraid of being laughed at by others? I am the first madam of the imperial court. Who dares to laugh at me? Chiu Meng was full of pride. Ms. Jiyu smiled and shook her head without saying anything. A trace of doting flashed in her eyes. She was the only daughter-in-law and daughter. She was reluctant to say anything to her. At this moment, in the east courtyard of the Ling mansion, Ling Li received the news from Ling Xian. He was so shocked that he stood up from the wheelchair. What? My mother directly invited Su Li to visit our home? A strange light flashed in Ling Xian's eyes. She gently nodded. Madam went to find the old lady and said that she wanted to make snacks with Miss Su Li. Ling Li suddenly felt a toothache. What the hell did she want to do? Confess? No, absolutely not. He was not ready yet. Although he didn't know what to prepare. Master, if you think it is troublesome, you can hide in the east courtyard. Ling Xian's proposal made Ling Li more worried. He didn't tell anyone that he went to see Chiu Meng alone. Of course, he didn't plan to tell anyone that for the time being, but, I don't want to hide. Chapter 236. In the Lord Rui's mansion, Yun Yi came to report Su Li's recent situation. Why did Madame Meng of the Ling General's mansion suddenly invite Li to be a guest? Dongfang Rui frowned and paced back and forth in the room. Yun Yi added, Mrs. Cooking skills are unparalleled. Madam Meng made a new snack and wanted to invite you to help. Dongfang Rui sneered and said, at the end of the year, the Ling family has a busy account. How can Chiu Meng be so free? I'm afraid that she has ulterior motives. However, Li is back to me now. With her identity, the Ling family won't dare to mess with her. You will accompany Li to the Ling mansion. Other guards of the Yunwei will wait outside to protect her. Su Li just came back to him. He didn't want to marry his daughter so soon. Yes, master. Yunyi bowed his head and smiled bitterly in his heart. With his cultivation, if he went with Su Li, he was afraid that Su Li would protect them more. Don't tell anyone about my other identity, including my father. Since you have passed my test, the guards of the Yunwei will also be members of the Linli building. Do you remember? Thinking of the order of the miss, Yunyi said nothing and left quietly. They knew the real identity of Su Li because they were recognized by the miss naturally. They wouldn't violate the miss's order. Every time he thought that Mr. Li, who was famous in the capital and could be on an equal footing with Child Li, the hierarch of the Enmore cult, was his master, Yunyi couldn't help but marvel again and again. It was a gamble to follow an unknown master after practicing hard for 20 years. Since he knew the identity of the miss in the auction house, he almost woke up with joy. That sense of honor and joy was difficult for ordinary people to understand. The miss must be a person who would do great things. If they could follow such a wonderful woman, their life must be full of wonderful. When Yun Yi and Lord Rui met, Wu Bin was beside them. However, he didn't find a shadow peeping on the city wall of the Lord Rui's mansion. When did the strength of the Lord Rui's mansion expand so much? Even a young senior in the inborn fourth hurdle is a servant. It's not easy. I must report it to the head of the family. The shadow receded quickly. No one found that he had been there. Yunyi returned to the affiliated school of the National Academy and told Su Li what Lord Rui said. Father wants you to go with him? Su Li raised her eyebrows slightly. It was not dangerous to go to the Ling mansion above board. If Ling Li had some arrangements, she could use Yunyi to fool him. She said, "Follow me and listen to me. Don't be careless." Yunyi was very surprised. Although General Ling's mansion was an important place in the imperial court and there was a legendary figure like Mrs. Ji Yu, no one could surpass Miss in terms of cultivation. Even General Ling Ping was definitely not Miss's opponent. Why was Miss so cautious? With this idea, Yun Yi and Su Li got on the carriage and went to Ling General's mansion. The servants of the Ling family who had been waiting in front of the door saw the carriage of the Lord Rui's mansion coming and hurriedly opened the door of the general's mansion to let the carriage in. The general's mansion was very spacious and there was a special parking place for carriages. Yun Yi stopped the horse according to the instructions of the servants. He immediately jumped off the carriage and lifted the curtain to welcome Su Li to get off. Su Li exhaled and glanced at the surrounding scenery with her clear eyes. In the previous life, she had only seen the ruins of the Ling family after the fire. Now she could see the real appearance of the Ling general's mansion, which made up for her regret. "Princess Li, this way please. Madam has been waiting for you in the lobby since early in the morning." A plump and gentle mammy came over and bowed to Su Li. Su Li followed her and smiled sweetly. She said softly, "What's your name, mammy?" The gentle mammy was immediately flattered. She lowered her head and replied, "Princess, you are too polite. My name is Li Qing." It turns out to be Mammy Li. Mammy Li nodded and led the way. She thought that Princess Li was the kindest girl she had ever seen. She was so similar to Madam. If Su Li could really become the young Madam, it would be a blessing for the servants. After a while, Su Li and Yun Yi came to the lobby. Chiu Meng in brocade clothes saw them and hurriedly came to Su Li. She gently held Su Li's hand and said, "Su Li, I have been waiting for you for a long time. You finally come." Su Li was shocked by Chiu Meng's enthusiasm. She wanted to pull her hand out, but found that Chiu Meng held her hand tightly. Su Li could only nod helplessly and said, "It's the first time for me to come to the general's mansion. I don't know the rules. If there is any violation, please don't blame me. Child, I ask you to help me. There are no rules. Come with me and have a taste of the snacks made by Aunt Meng." Chiu Meng pulled Su Li to the backyard, as if she really just wanted to make snacks. Su Li was a little relieved and followed Chiu Meng. Yun Yi hurriedly followed her. In his eyes, Miss was well-educated, gentle and polite at first. Then Miss became Mr. Li, who was mysterious, powerful and resourceful. However, no matter what the image of Miss was, she was always at ease and had the initiative. It was the first time for him to see Miss being pulled around by Chiu Meng. It was quite interesting and he couldn't help but smile. At this moment, in the east courtyard of the Ling mansion, Ling Li helplessly faced Ling Ping and sighed, "Second brother, I have changed my clothes. I don't need the hairpin, right?" Ling Ping handed the hairpin to Ling Xian and wanted to scold him. But he couldn't help laughing. He could only scold with a smile. "Mother specially called me back from the military camp outside the city for such a small thing. If I don't finish it, I will be scolded again." "Xian, what are you waiting for? Su Li is here. How can you meet her when you haven't changed your clothes?" Ling Xian was still in a daze. When she heard Ling Ping's order, she immediately went forward and took off the hairpin on Ling Li's head. His long hair suddenly spilled down like splashing ink, covering his forehead and side face. A pair of deep eyes reflected a little silver line. The young man, who was originally filled with the aura of a playboy, suddenly had a great change in temperament. He was like a shining sharp sword. Ling Ping was stunned for a moment and a picture flashed in his mind. 3 or 4 years ago, he was ambushed. After the bloody battle, the only few lieutenants around him were all dead. He was the only one who was at the end of his strength and still persisted. The enemy still had a small team of cavalry. In addition, the enemy's general, whose cultivation was 1 level higher than his, hadn't fought yet. He was like a mouse that was fooled by the enemy. The setting sun was like blood. It was a fatal situation. He rushed to the cavalry with the determination to die. But at that time, a black shadow fell from the sky. It was a young man with disheveled hair. After a few ups and downs, the sword in his hand turned into thousands of light. All the enemies were beheaded. He still remembered the smell of blood in his nose and the sticky breath. He wanted to go forward and see the face of the young man, but the young man had no intention of getting in touch with him. In the blink of an eye, he jumped into the mountain and disappeared, leaving only his long black hair and the silver light reflected by the sword light. He would be Brother Li? Ling Ping was shocked by his own guess. How could he suspect Brother Li? Brother Li obviously didn't practice. Seeing the change of Ling Ping's expression, Ling Li immediately thought of the time when he didn't have a mask with him. He had to take off his crown and cover his face with his hair to save his second brother. He knew something was wrong. He quickly covered his face with his hands and turned around. He deliberately shouted angrily, "Xian, what are you doing? Your hair is scattered. It's so ugly. Fix it for me." "Master, please calm down. I'll fix it," Ling Xian said timidly. She quickly tied up Ling Li's hair. Coupled with Ling Li's signature playboy's angry look, Ling Ping's image in his heart was immediately destroyed. He couldn't help but scratch his head. Did he not sleep well last night? So, he had hallucinations. How could someone like Brother Li be that mysterious person? At this moment, in the backyard of Ling General's mansion, Su Li tasted the snack made by Chiu Meng. She couldn't help but be surprised. The snack made by Chiu Meng was not good in appearance and taste. But the unique taste reminded her of the Peiyun cake she tasted in the previous life. How about the snack? Facing Chiu Meng's expectant eyes, Su Li nodded and praised, "The recipe is very special. The taste is also very special. I have never tasted it in my life." Chiu Meng's eyes flashed with the light of appreciation. This girl was not like those young ladies who would try to flatter him as soon as possible. Instead, she was telling the truth. In fact, she liked Su Li. Even if Su Li just praised the snack, she would definitely think that Su Li was too sweet. Chiu Meng sighed and confessed, "Little Su Li, to tell you the truth, I made the snack under the guidance of the old lady. The snack shop of the Jiyu family was famous in Yunjing City. Later, the old lady joined the army. The Jiyu family lost its inheritance and the shop was closed." Su Li's eyes flickered. She had heard about the snack of the Jiyu family in books. It was mentioned in the biography of Mrs. Gu that the Gu family used to make snacks. But there was no more description in the book. She didn't expect that the snack of the Gu family was so famous. But in the previous life, after the destruction of the Ling mansion, the snack house of the Gu family did not belong to the Dongfang family, but to the Wu family. Was the Dongfang family not the opponent of the Wu family? Su Li was confused. Chiu Meng had taken out a copy of the snack recipe and put it in front of her. She looked nostalgic. I invite you here for nothing else. I just hope that you can restore the taste of the snack of the Gu family. I heard that you like to study cooking since you were a child and you are very talented. The old lady is getting on in years and doesn't have the energy to study dessert recipes. I also know myself. Just by looking at the results I made in one night, I know that I'm not suitable for cooking. Su Li couldn't help but say with a smile, the old lady is very talented. Even if ordinary people work all night, they may not be able to make such a taste. She is just too busy and has no time. Really? Chiu Meng's eyes lit up, but every time I have time to cook, it is not very delicious. Chapter 237. Chiu Meng was so moved that she almost agreed. But when she thought of the purpose of this trip, she immediately closed her mouth and broke into a cold sweat. It would be a sin if she forgot her son for the sake of cooking. There's still a long way to go. It's not urgent. I'll give you the recipe. Chiu Meng waved her hand. Su Li was slightly shocked and quickly returned the recipe to Chiu Meng. She refused. Madam, how can I accept a reward without doing anything? Su Li can't accept such a precious snack recipe. Chiu Meng put the recipe in Su Li's hand again. She chuckled and said, just take it. This is also the old lady's idea. No one in the Ling family can make snacks. If we keep it, it will be a piece of waste paper. It's better to give it to you. If you can restore the taste of the past, the old lady and I can also buy some snacks to enjoy. Su Li hurriedly shook her head. Madam, if I can really study it, I will definitely send snacks to you and the old lady. How can I let you spend money? Ha ha ha, so you agree? The nostalgia on Chiu Meng's face disappeared. Her expression was quite a feeling that her scheme had succeeded. Su Li was stunned for a moment and nodded helplessly. In order to let her accept the recipe, Chiu Meng even used a trick. It was too shameless. Oh, I suddenly remember that I have to attend the tea party held by Madame Yu today. Su Li, I have to go out immediately. Chiu Meng suddenly stood up and said anxiously. Her acting skills. Yunyi was speechless. It's impolite for me to leave as soon as you come. By the way, my third son is at home. It's better to let him accompany you for a while as a host. Don't refuse. I'll be back soon. Although Chiu Meng's acting skills were poor, she blocked all the reasons for Su Li to refuse. She could only nod. Yunyi tried his best not to laugh out loud, but it was hard for him to hold it. His face was red. Fortunately, his face was dark enough that no one could see it. Soon, Chiu Meng pretended to leave the Ling mansion. In fact, she returned to the backyard and secretly cheered Ling Li up. Li, I have done what I should do. You have to work hard for the rest. Su Li put away the recipe and followed the maid to the gate of the east courtyard. She looked up at the vines climbing over the courtyard wall, and a light flashed in her eyes. In his previous life, it was precisely because of this that the Ling family's crime of treason was firmly pinned down, with no chance of escaping. Ling Li really lived here. Obviously, Chiu Meng had already arranged it. When Su Li and Yun Yi were taken to the gate of the east courtyard, they walked in without any notice. Walking through the long corridor, Yun Yi found at least a dozen breaths of warriors of the inborn realm in the dark. He couldn't help but feel speechless. The protection of the Ling mansion for the playboy was no less than that of Su Li. No wonder the Ling mansion had such a prodigal son. At the end of the corridor, there was a small courtyard. The maid standing on both sides of the courtyard door opened the door for Su Li. The scene in the courtyard was reflected in their eyes. The plum blossoms in the courtyard were in full bloom. It was very elegant under the shade of green. It was far from the luxury that Yun Yi imagined. Wasn't Ling Li a playboy? Why did he live in such a shabby courtyard? At the moment when Su Li stepped in, her eyes brightened slightly. She perceived the existence of the tactical matrix. Ling Li didn't know about the tactical matrix. It was mostly the work of the Enmore cult. Although it was not as good as the person who taught her the tactical matrix in her previous life, it was also at the master level. Ling Xian stood under the eaves in front of the door. When she saw Su Li, she looked gentle and smiled. "Princess Li, child has been waiting for you for a long time." Ling Xian bowed her head and made way for Su Li. Su Li looked at her and was about to push the door in. Suddenly, she stopped and said, "Child Ling can use you as a maid. It is really luxurious." Ling Xian's expression changed slightly. She bowed her head and didn't dare to look at Su Li. But she was shocked. Her cultivation was seen through. How could it be possible? Yun Yi didn't hear the hidden meaning in Su Li's words, nor did he see that Ling Xian had the cultivation of the inborn sixth hurdle. He just looked at Ling Xian subconsciously and found that Ling Xian was really beautiful. Her temperament was not like that of a maid, but she was still not as good as his miss. He thought so. Suddenly, he heard Su Li said, "Yun Yi, you also come in with me." "Me too." Yun Yi was stunned. When he saw Su Li's unquestionable look, he could only bite the bullet and follow her in. He had no experience to help Su Li block the lascivious girls. After entering the room, Yun Yi saw Ling Li sitting in a wheelchair beside the round table. At this moment, Ling Li wore a light golden robe and a tidy crown. His face was as sharp as a knife, and his eyebrows were straight to the sky. His eyes were shining like stars, and his lips were so thin that they seemed to be sharp. Yun Yi was stunned on the spot. Was this Ling Li, the first playboy in Yunjing? Was there any misunderstanding about him in the rumor? This person was obviously introverted. He was not simple in any way. If he didn't sit in a wheelchair, Yun Yi almost thought that he saw a young master. It was really rare that such a temperament could appear on a disabled child. Ling Li's eyes suddenly fell on Yun Yi. He looked at Su Li with questioning eyes. Su Li didn't seem to see it. She directly stretched out her hand and said, "Give me the thing, and the deal between you and me is completed." What? Miss and Ling Li had known each other for a long time? Yun Yi was surprised again. It seemed that since he entered the East Courtyard, he had never been frightened. Ling Li paused and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He was afraid that Su Li misunderstood. He didn't mean to use his mother to call her over. But even if he explained it, it was not clear. Recalling the strategy of making a last-minute effort from his mother, Ling Li helplessly lifted the blanket, stood up and walked to the desk. He turned the inkstone, and immediately a downward stone ladder appeared on the ground. "Where are you taking me?" Su Li frowned and asked. Yun Yi was completely dumbfounded. The third master of the Ling family, he actually stood up. Wasn't he disabled since he was a child? Everything was fake. "Miss." Yun Yi couldn't help but look at Su Li, but found that Su Li was not surprised at all. She actually knew it. Su Li didn't say anything. Ling Li glanced at Yun Yi, who was surprised, and said strangely, "Since he is your henchman, you didn't tell him anything?" Some things can be understood by looking at it. There is no need to say it. Su Li shook her head and pointed to the secret passage. "You dare to dig a tunnel in the Ling mansion? Aren't you afraid of being known by the Dongfang family?" Ling Li's face flashed a touch of evil. He chuckled and said, "I am the most eye-catching and the most inconspicuous in the eyes of Dongfang Xiao. He can't search my yard unless the sun rises from the west." Who would think that a playboy who had been disabled for more than 10 years would have a big secret where he lived? Chapter 238. Chiu Meng ordered servants to prepare lunch and asked the mammy to go to the East Courtyard to call Ling Li and Su Li. However, the mammy came back alone and said happily, "Madam, the little master and Miss Su Li went out to play together. They are not in the East Courtyard." Chiu Meng was surprised and happy. Then she thought of something and asked urgently, "It is not peaceful in Yunjing City. How can they go out alone? Didn't the guards follow them?" Xian said that Miss Su and several guards of the East Courtyard followed Miss Su all the time. "Madam, don't worry." Chiu Meng breathed a sigh of relief and her eyes were full of smiles. The silly boy said that he didn't know how to make girls happy. But soon after they met, the girl was willing to go out to play. It seemed that Li's marriage was possible. Thinking of this, Chiu Meng looked at the sumptuous dishes on the table and sat down to eat decisively. Her appetite became better. Her stomach was too small, so of course she couldn't eat it. It would definitely be a waste. But it was rare for the Ling mansion to waste food. A bright light lit up in the dark tunnel, illuminating the three people's tracks. Yunyi walked at the end and was full of amazement. The underground of Yunjing City was hard slate. How much manpower, material resources, and time did it take to build such a tunnel? Ling Li, the disabled master, had a big secret. Step, step, step. The echo of footsteps was very clear in the quiet environment. Su Li looked indifferent, but she was surprised in her heart. She thought that there was a secret chamber hidden under the east courtyard, but it turned out to be a road. Where did this road lead to? The three people walked fast. After about 5 minutes, there was a turn in the tunnel and the smell of earth came. Yunyi immediately realized that it was the junction of the outer city of Yunjing City. The secret tunnel was dug from the Ling mansion to the outer city. Even if it was dug in a straight line, it was more than 10 miles away. Yunyi roughly estimated the manpower consumed and looked at Ling Li's back with awe. The third master of the Ling family was much more mysterious and horrible than he thought. Crack. At this moment, Ling Li stopped. Su Li narrowed her eyes. There was a fork in the road. In the middle of the tunnel, there was an upward stone ladder. She recalled the map of Yunjing City and immediately knew where it was. She couldn't help but ask, "Why did you bring me here?" Ling Li's eyes were shining. He smiled and shook his head. His voice was gentle and low. "Today I will take you to a special place. Little brother, please go upstairs and have a seat." Yunyi was stunned and subconsciously pointed at himself. "Me? Not bad." Ling Li nodded slightly and did not explain. Yunyi looked at Su Li and asked. Su Li pondered for a while and nodded, "Go up and be polite." The next place was obviously more important than the headquarters of Enmore. Yunyi still couldn't be completely trusted by Ling Li. But why does he trust me so completely? Yes, miss. Seeing Su Li's approval, Yunyi turned around and walked up the stone stairs. He murmured in his heart, "Maureen, sounds familiar. I seem to have heard it somewhere." There were dozens of stairs leading up. Yunyi walked to the end and came to a small room, which was filled with all kinds of weapons and clothes. They shone with a cold light. At first glance, one could tell that they were excellent weapons and armor. Without any clue, Yunyi opened the door of the room and went out. When he saw the scene outside, he was dumbfounded. In the spacious and bright lobby, Ling Qinglan with a cyan fox mask sat in the first seat. He leaned back on the chair and crossed his hands on his chest. In front of him was a long conference table. Ling Liuyi and others were there. The sound of the door opening came into everyone's ears. In an instant, dozens of fierce and hostile eyes swept over Yunyi like arrows. He was so shocked that he had goosebumps. What the hell was this place? How could there be so many seniors of the inborn realm gathered together? And the atmosphere was so cold. Each of these people in front of him carried at least dozens of lives. He didn't dare to act rashly. He slowly turned his eyes and finally looked at Ling Qinglan's mask. A cyan fox, this mask, it was also very familiar. He looked up slightly and suddenly saw a big pattern of jade bone mask carved on the screen behind Ling Qinglan. He suddenly realized. Wasn't this the mask of the hierarch of the Enmore cult? Wait. Yunyi suddenly realized, and his face suddenly became very ugly. He should have thought of the figure with a cyan fox mask in front of him. Cyan fox, wasn't this cyan fox? Who are you? Looking at Yunyi's colorful face, Ling Qinglan said lightly. He was not nervous at all. He didn't think that the east courtyard of the Ling mansion would be broken through suddenly, and today happened to be. Yunyi felt numb and said with a stiff expression, "I am the guard of Princess Li." "Where is this place?" Puff. Ling Liuyi suddenly laughed and couldn't help but say, "You have come here, but you don't know where this place is? Now I will tell you. Listen carefully. This is Maureen, the headquarter of the Enmore cult. Yun Yi felt dizzy and almost fell down. He held the door with one hand and covered his chest with the other. He couldn't speak for a long time. At this moment, monstrous waves were surging in his heart. Maureen. It was really Maureen, the legendary headquarter of the Enmore cult. What was the identity of child Ling Li? Since Ling Li could take him to the headquarter, his status in the Enmore cult must be high. He was at least a protector. Unexpectedly, a young master of the general's mansion of the imperial court had such a deep connection with the leading sect of the Enmore cult in the martial arts circle. It was shocking. Seeing that Yun Yi was frightened, Ling Qinglan laughed in his heart. He waved his hand and said, "Go away. Don't scare the guests. Come on, serve tea." Ling Li's affection for Su Li couldn't be more obvious. Since this person was Su Li's confidant, he must be treated well. Yun Yi came to his senses and reluctantly squeezed a smile. He stammered, Thank you, Lord Qinghu." It was no wonder that he was nervous. Qinghu was the most powerful person in the entire Enmore cult except for Child Li. It was said that after Qinghu became the military counselor of the Enmore cult, he organized several sects to clean up. He killed those sects that showed slight skill in front of the Enmore cult in the past. Many sects of the same scale as the Yunj sect were destroyed. It was really terrible. After they sat down and talked for a while, Yun Yi found that Qinghu didn't seem to be as terrible as he imagined. However, he was full of knowledge and unparalleled wisdom, as the rumor said. Qinghu broadened his horizons in just a few minutes. "Lord Qinghu, I have a question, but I don't know whether I should ask." Yun Yi held the teacup and looked cautious. But he couldn't bear the curiosity in his heart and said it. "What do you want to ask?" Ling Qinglan still said with a little teasing in his eyes. He just asked Yun Yi why he didn't know that Su Li was a servant of Yun Yi. Yun Yi answered, "Miss said that I should go by myself. She doesn't need to explain. Miss Su Li was really as wonderful as Mr. Li. I want to ask, the third child of the Ling General's mansion, what is the relationship between child Ling Li and your cult?" Yun Yi asked nervously and quickly added, "If it is the secret of your cult, Lord Qinghu, you don't have to pay attention to it. I am just a little curious." "It is indeed a secret." Ling Qinglan nodded. Yun Yi was a little depressed. But the latter half of the former's words made him confused. "However, since you come with Ling Li, it is not a secret." Then Ling Qinglan pointed to the screen and said, "Do you see the pattern of the mask?" Yun Yi nodded quickly and said, "Of course. Who in the world doesn't know the name Young Master Li? Who doesn't know about it? That mask belongs to Ling Li." Ling Qinglan added faintly, and Yun Yi was stunned. Child Ling Li was the hierarch of the Enmore cult. Child Li? Drip. Water dripped from the stone crevices in the tunnel. Su Li took a drop of water and put it on her fingertips. She said, "This is the barren mountain outside Yunjing City. Is your Enmore cult a mouse? Why do you dig such a long tunnel?" Su Li's metaphor was quite offensive. If anyone else said so, Ling Li would be angry. But facing Su Li, he could only smile bitterly and said, "Su Li, do you know what is the most important thing for a force in the martial arts circle to have a long life?" "Of course, vitality. Only a faction with a constant stream of new blood will not be defeated." Su Li said the answer without thinking. Then she suddenly realized something. She blinked and said, "Is the secluded place where the Enmore cult trains new blood in the barren mountain?" Ling Li was surprised at first, and then his eyes became complicated. He felt jealous, but he deliberately pretended to be calm. "It seems that you are very familiar with the affairs of the sect. Is it because of the Li building?" Su Li frowned slightly and said unhappily, "Don't get me too close to Mr. Li. I have nothing to do with him." She created Mr. Li to disassociate herself from Ling Li. If Ling Li thought that she had something to do with the Li building, all her efforts would be in vain. But Su Li didn't know that when her words fell into Ling Li's ears, they were immediately misinterpreted into another meaning. Su Li and Mr. Li were not close. Was she explaining it to me? Could it be that she also cares about my feelings? Several thoughts emerged in Ling Li's mind at once. Strange emotions surged, and his cold and evil face suddenly became relaxed and gentle. He walked cheerfully. "We are almost there." There are endless barren mountains above, so I call it the barren mountain yard. Then Ling Li deliberately slowed down his pace to make his body level with Su Li's. He peeped at Su Li's side face, and his eyes were unconsciously gentle. Chapter 239. The barren mountain yard was the first decision made by Ling Li on the day he took over as hierarch. It had been nearly 10 years. The size of the barren mountain yard had also been expanded several times. Several hillsides had been hollowed out, which were connected by delicate mechanisms. It was the source of talents for the Enmore cult. After another turn, the entrance of the yard was in sight. Ling Li took out the jadebone mask from his arms and put it on. Even in the Enmore cult, only a few high-level people knew his real identity. Greetings to the hierarch. Greetings to the hierarch. As soon as they arrived at the door, two black figures flashed out from both sides and knelt down. Su Li followed Ling Li and found that they were the elite killers of the Sholu cult. Ling Li began to show Su Li various means of cultivating talents of the Enmore cult. With Ling Li's identity, Su Li was naturally unimpeded. There were only two standards to test talents. One was loyalty, one was talent, and the other was will. It was similar to the secluded place of the Linley building. However, the Enmore cult had a long history and many means. She benefited a lot from watching them. She was going to move some means to the Linley building when she went back. No outsider had ever come to the barren mountain yard. At this moment, Su Li was obviously not a member of the cult. Seeing that their hierarch was so attentive, they couldn't help but look at Su Li strangely. Some people with high cultivation even transmitted the sound to each other and gossiped. Is she, the future Madam Hierarch? What should we do with the holy girl? Well, I heard that as long as one's cultivation is high enough, the transmission of sound can be eavesdropped. Hiss. It's the private affairs of the hierarch. We'd better not offend him. Then no one dared to transmit the sound. Ling Li's cultivation hadn't reached the longevity realm. Naturally, he didn't have the ability to cut off others' transmission of sound. At this moment, he had taken Su Li to a beautifully decorated stone room in the depth of the yard. As the hierarch, Ling Li naturally had a separate residence in each stronghold of the cult. They sat down, and Ling Li made a cup of tea for Su Li personally. No matter in the previous life or this life, he never neglected wine, tea, and food. Su Li quietly looked at Ling Li's coherent and smooth movements. He still liked to play with tea as in the previous life. But in the previous life, he could only play with the wild tea that he picked in the mountain by himself. In this life, he could play with the best tea carefully cultivated by the tea farmers. Don't you have anything to ask me? Ling Li calmed down for a moment and finally spoke. Although he tried to keep calm, Su Li still saw that he was a little weird. Indeed, Ling Li was different from usual today. He was too enthusiastic. Every sect's secret place was even more secretive than the headquarters, but he actually brought him here without saying anything. What was the meaning of this? Did he want me to join the Enmore cult or, Su Li frowned slightly, did you lose the full moon and heartstrings? Cough, cough, cough. Ling Li's eyes widened and he almost spat out a mouthful of tea. Although he held back, he still choked and coughed. The courage that he had just summoned up was defeated by Su Li. Seeing that his reaction was so big, Su Li was full of surprise. I just said it casually. Did I really lose it? Casually said it. Ling Li was so upset that he wanted to vomit blood. Without saying anything, he took out the glass bottle from his sleeve and put it on the table. The full moon and heartstrings was so important and what Su Li needed, so he always kept it close to him. Take it. Ling Qinglan's account is settled. Su Li took the glass bottle which was still warm. Her heart slightly rippled, but she quickly suppressed it. She calmly put it away and said, "Thank you for your help in the Lord Rui's mansion last time. In this way, you still owe me an unconditional request. Then we are even." Hearing such a cold trading tone, Ling Li became serious and said in a complicated tone, "Do you have to calculate the relationship between us so clearly? What does Hierarch Ling want?" Su Li lowered her eyes and looked indifferent, but her heartbeat sped up unconsciously. A strange emotion grew in her heart. Ling Li said a word, but the rest of the words seemed to be blocked by a stone in his throat. Say it. Ling Li, if not now, when will you say it? He couldn't say it. If he was refused, he would be ashamed. There seemed to be two consciousnesses in his mind, and they were constantly entangled. Ling Li tightened his lips and slowly squeezed his knees with his hands hidden under the table, but he could no longer say a word. Su Li's face flashed a touch of obscure self-mockery. In this life, what were you still looking forward to? Hierarchling, since I have got the thing, I will not disturb your cultivation. I will leave now. Su Li's voice was calm. She gently put down the teacup and turned to leave without hesitation. But at this moment, Ling Li suddenly raised his head, and a calm and firm voice suddenly sounded in the room. Su Li, are you willing to be my wife? In the affiliated school of the National Academy, Wu Bin stood in front of the door and looked at the direction where Su Li left in the morning. He was a little worried. Most of the day had passed. Even the Manchu and Han Imperial feast should have been ready. Why didn't Miss come back? Although the third child of the Ling family was a bastard, he certainly didn't dare to act recklessly with Madame Chiu at home. What on earth delayed her? At this moment, it was not the time for the class to end. The road in front of the affiliated school of the National Academy was empty. There were only 2 or 3 pedestrians. Suddenly, Wu Bin stared at the man in the bamboo hat who walked straight to the affiliated school of the National Academy. Stop. This is the important place of the National Academy. Irrelevant people leave. The guard at the door immediately scolded. The man in the bamboo hat looked up a little and showed his face. Wu Bin's expression changed slightly. He quickly asked the guard to leave and led the man in the bamboo hat into the affiliated school of the National Academy. After entering the front room, the man in the bamboo hat took off the bamboo hat and showed a young face. He was the 4th prince of Tianji country, Tan Tai Yu. After the auction fair, all forces have withdrawn from Yunjing City. I didn't expect that Prince Tan Tai is still here. Wu Bin said respectfully with a little vigilance. The prince of Tianji country was distinguished, so he must be treated carefully. But why did he come to the place where Miss lived? How did Miss have a relationship with the prince of Tianji country? Tan Tai Yu looked at Wu Bin's vigilant look and immediately smiled. He said, Butler Wu, don't be nervous. I come here today to say goodbye to Su Li. Wu Bin hesitated for a moment and asked, Your Highness, may I ask why you and Miss? Tan Tai Yu shook his head and said, Since she didn't say it, I can't disobey her. If you want to know, ask her yourself. Speaking of this, Tan Tai Yu sighed and said with self-mockery, It seems that she doesn't want to see me again. Well, Butler Wu, please give me this sword. Tan Tai Yu stretched out his hand. Wu Bin noticed the sword in his hand. He couldn't help but be surprised. It was the Hanfeng sword which was worth 10 million yuan at the auction fair. This, Wu Bin hesitated. If he rashly accepted the thing that Miss was willing to accept, it would be a sin. Don't worry. This thing is just a gift for our first meeting. There is no other meaning. Tan Tai Yu explained with a smile. He gently put the long sword on the table and was about to leave. His figure was a little bit desolate. Wu Bin couldn't bear it and couldn't help but say, Your Highness, please wait. It's not that Miss doesn't want to see you today. She went to the Ling mansion as a guest early in the morning and made snacks with Madame Ling. If you really want to see Miss, it's better to wait here. Tan Tai Yu slightly stopped and turned around with a little more gratitude on his face. He said, Thank you, Butler Wu. Otherwise, I will regret it for the rest of my life. Your Highness, you are too kind. Wu Bin quickly asked someone to make tea. Looking at Tan Tai Yu's gentle and humble manner, he couldn't help but think a little more. Tan Tai Yu's appearance was superior, he treated people respectfully, and his cultivation was at least above the inborn 3rd hurdle. Moreover, his performance in the imperial court that day was also very outstanding. Such a person might be the future emperor of Tianji country. Master was reluctant to part with Miss. But Miss was now 17 years old. She had to find a good husband. The situation in Yunjing City was too complicated. Only General Ling Ping of the Ling family could match Miss. But General Ling Ping didn't seem to marry and he was a little old. Tantai Yu was only 19 years old. He was only 2 years older than Miss. It was just right. Even if Miss was not willing now, he had to help Miss pay attention first. In the yard on the barren mountain, Su Li stopped at the door with her back to Ling Li. Her body became stiff and she couldn't move. Ling Li. What did he say just now? Crash. Ling Li quickly bypassed the table and accidentally hit the teacup. It fell to the ground and broke into pieces. But he didn't care about it. He walked behind Su Li with unprecedented concentration and seriousness. His voice was low and hoarse. Su Li, the Ling family has been loyal for generations, but they died miserably. There must be a villain behind them. I once vowed that if I didn't find the murderer in this life, I would never have a love affair. But you made me break the oath. I also thought that when I get my revenge, I will confess to you. But I am afraid that you will be someone else's wife at that time. I can't bear it just thinking about it. So, let me be selfish once. I tell you in advance, are you willing to wait for me? When I get my revenge, I will marry you. I will only love you in this life. At that time in the Desu town, you didn't want to listen to my explanation. Now I will tell you. I was born with the memory of my previous life. I came from a place called the Earth. At that time, I was the king of killers. Ling Shui was my biological sister in the previous life. But she killed me later. I didn't know why until I died. It became my obsession. You can cook dishes and brew wine from the earth. So, there was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to annoy you at that time. My mother said that if I want to pursue you, I have to be honest with you. You already know all about my background. If you want to know more, I won't hold anything back from you. Are you willing to be my wife in the future? In the end, Ling Li's voice couldn't help but tremble. He stared at Su Li, who slowly turned around. When he saw the expression on her face, his blood suddenly cooled down. Chapter 240. Su Li's words were indifferent and heartless, like the unchanging ice of a mountain for thousands of years. Ling Li seemed to be struck by thunder and was stunned on the spot. He stared at Su Li's plain face with his eyes. His lips trembled, but he didn't dare to ask why. If there is nothing else, I will leave. The steady voice came again. Su Li looked at the man like a sculpture in front of her. She didn't wait for his answer and turned away without hesitation. Ling Li was still frozen in the same place and didn't move for a long time. Immersed in sadness, he didn't notice that Su Li's back had a hint of fleeing. Although people in the barren mountain yard wondered why Su Li left alone, no one asked her because of Ling Li's deterrence. Su Li went back to the tunnel smoothly. Looking back to make sure that no one followed her, Su Li couldn't help sliding down the stone wall with one hand. She grabbed her chest and unlocked the secret skill. Blood overflowed from the corner of her mouth instantly. Her indifferent expression was broken, replaced by deep guilt and pain. Tears fell from the corner of her eyes like broken beads. She almost couldn't help but agree. At the last moment, she had to use the secret skill to seal her emotions to refuse. She slowly closed her eyes. Various things in the previous life floated in front of her eyes. Several encounters and entanglements in this life seemed to blur the boundary between the previous life and this life, which made her full of confusion. Yes, I swear that if there is an afterlife, I will definitely return all the sufferings I have suffered. Su Li, you are just a lonely ghost crawling out of hell for revenge. Are you qualified to touch other things? Su Li laughed in a low voice. Her voice was hoarse and desolate. Tears flowed freely. The blood on the corner of her mouth was not dry, but she didn't wipe it. She just straightened up awkwardly and walked to the depths of the dark passage step by step. As she thought, she was like a lonely and wandering ghost. Soon after Su Li left, a light flashed in the dark passage. An old figure appeared out of thin air. The face of this person was illuminated by the lamp. He was the old beggar who had told Su Li's fortune. But the way he appeared was very strange, like a ghost. The old beggar walked to the wall where Su Li stood before. Looking at the blood on the ground, he couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. Obsession is harmful. Ling Li returned to the Ling mansion absent-mindedly. Ling Xian pushed the wheelchair behind him. There was a touch of joy and worry in her eyes. Fortunately, Su Li didn't agree and didn't take the young master away from her. But the young master was hurt by this. If he couldn't recover from this setback, what should he do? When Qiu Meng heard that her son came back, she quickly put down the account in her hand and came out to greet him. When she saw Ling Li's half-dead appearance, her heart suddenly sank. She walked quickly to hold Ling Li's wheelchair and motioned Ling Xian to leave. Ling Xian hesitated for a moment and let go. Madam was the young master's mother. She might have a way to cheer up the young master, but Madam seemed to think highly of Su Li. No matter how worried Ling Xian was, she couldn't control the situation. After all, she was just a maid in the Ling mansion. The decision she made in order to stay with Ling Li became the biggest stumbling block now. At this moment, in the study, Qiu Meng hurriedly asked her son about the situation. What? You're going to confess? Qiu Meng looked at her son in shock and suddenly became angry. She said angrily, "You silly boy, have you been a playboy all these years in vain? You just went out with her for the first time. How dare you confess? She is a virgin and very reserved. Isn't it obvious that she doesn't agree?" Ling Li was stunned and stammered, Is that so?" Qiu Meng acted like an experienced person and taught him a lesson. Of course. You can't be too hasty in pursuing a girl. You have to take your time. I tried my best to open up the situation for you. I thought you could be smart and slowly cultivate Su Li's affection for you. Who knows you? Alas. Let me think about how to remedy it. Ling Li scratched his head and looked silly. At this moment, he didn't look like a resourceful devil of the Enmore cult who controlled the life and death of thousands of people. He was just a simple boy who had his first awakening of love. He always felt that there was something wrong with what his mother said, but it made some sense. Was it really too hasty? He thought of everything that happened in the Desu town, the encounter outside the Hongyang house under the boat, and the various contacts because of the full moon and heartstrings. It seemed that what Qiu Meng said was true. Yes. He didn't deliberately try to win Su Li's affection from beginning to end. Ling Li's eyes became brighter and brighter. Mother, I know what to do. At this moment, Su Li went to the Linli building to change her clothes stained with mud. She changed into the same style clothes and returned to the affiliated school of the National Academy. She looked calm and indifferent. It couldn't be seen that she had cried. Yun Yi was taken out of the Enmore Street by Su Li later. He was still shocked that the headquarters of the Enmore cult was a street, so he didn't notice the change of Su Li on the way. Miss, you finally come back. Wu Bin greeted her and looked at Su Li nervously. Seeing that she was still dressed neatly and spotless, he immediately felt a little relieved and said, "A distinguished guest has been waiting in the affiliated school for a long time." Su Li blinked her eyes and walked in. Yun Yi went to have a rest. Butler Wu wanted to follow her, but Su Li stopped him and said, "Butler Wu, go ahead. I will not be in danger." "Yes, miss." Butler Wu knew that Su Li sent him away. He smiled like a blooming old chrysanthemum and turned around. Su Li came to the school in the front room of the affiliated school alone. As expected, she saw Tan Tai Yu sitting in the center of the school with his back to her. Hearing the movement, Tan Tai Yu turned around and saw Su Li. He immediately showed a gentle smile and said, "Junior sister apprentice, you are back." Su Li nodded slightly and walked to the opposite of Tan Tai Yu. They looked at each other, but Tan Tai Yu avoided her eyes with a little panic. His ears were red. Tan Tai Yu cursed in his heart. Originally, he was very happy to have another junior sister apprentice, but he was not good at getting along with women. He left a bad impression on Su Li at their first meeting. Now it might be worse. Such a clumsy action made Su Li feel relieved. She smiled sweetly and said, "Senior fellow apprentice, you are so interesting." Huh! Tan Tai Yu was stunned, and then his face became redder. "Senior fellow apprentice, you should return to your country after the auction fair. Otherwise, it is too dangerous. Why do you still stay in Yunjing City? Did junior sister apprentice care about him?" Tan Tai Yu felt warm and deeply agreed with Su Li's words. It was really dangerous to contact with the Enmore cult and the Linli building in Yunjing City. Tan Tai Yu took out the Hanfeng sword and handed it to Su Li. He smiled and said, "It's time to leave. I come here today to say goodbye to you. I think you don't have a suitable weapon. This Hanfeng sword. Many thanks, senior brother." After the auction fair, weapons of the same level as the Hanfeng sword had been piled up in the Linli building. But Su Li still nodded and took it with a smile. Tan Tai Yu's wish was fulfilled. Seeing Su Li accept his gift, Tan Tai Yu was happy. He hesitated for a moment and whispered, "In fact, this time, Master also came. Why didn't Master come to see me?" Su Li was confused and her eyes flickered slightly. Of course, she had known that Qi Xianqing came and was caught by Ling Li as a road sign. If Ling Li didn't consider the relationship between Qi Xianqing and herself, it was still unknown whether they could leave Yunjing City alive. Tan Tai Yu sighed and said, "I just know that Master used to be the royal preceptor of Dahan country. Later, he fell out with the Dongfang family. Now you are the princess of Dahan country. Master probably hasn't thought about how to see you." "I see." Su Li nodded, but she didn't think so. If Qi Xianqing really cared about the secular rules, how could he accept her as a disciple? In the previous life, when the Ghost Valley was born, countless people wanted to be its disciple. But the first rule of the Ghost Valley was that they would never accept women. Tan Tai Yu left quickly with warmth and joy. The relationship between him and his junior sister apprentice finally took the first step. Su Li went upstairs and stood in front of the window on the second floor. Looking at the vast night, she felt a little confused. She wanted to know why Qi Xianqing came to compete for the full moon and heartstrings. But Qi Xianqing's action had failed. It seemed that Tan Tai Yu didn't want to tell her. If she asked, she had to expose some relationship. So, she had to give up. She took out the glass bottle from her sleeve and faced it to the moonlight. The full moon and heartstrings shone. All martial arts practitioners knew that the full moon and heartstrings should be taken on the night of the full moon. With the essence of the moon, the full moon and heartstrings could be refined into the immortal mansion of the full moon, so that the combat power could be greatly increased. But she learned another use of the full moon and heartstrings from the extraordinary woman in the previous life. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly, and her eyes flashed with firmness. It was a difficult and dangerous road, but it was what she needed most now. The next morning, Mammy Li got up and washed. Then she began to prepare breakfast for Su Li. The courtyard had been cleaned by the servants. Now she only needed to dress Su Li well. But at this time, there was a noise in front of the affiliated school. Who dares to make trouble here? Mammy Li was curious. She added a handful of firewood to the fire and went out. When she saw the scene at the door, she was dumbfounded. "Wu Bin, how dare you stop me?" No, third masterling, it's just," Wu Bin smiled bitterly. He didn't understand why this playboy came here. It seemed that if he didn't stop him, he would directly go into the mansion of the miss. "Then I ask you, is this the affiliated school of the National Academy?" Ling Li asked arrogantly. "Yes." Wu Bin didn't understand what Ling Li wanted to do. He could only nod. Ling Li heard it and smiled evilly. He said loudly, "Ling Mo, tell him, what is the affiliated school of the National Academy?" Ling Mo immediately replied with no expression, "Master, the affiliated school of the National Academy is a place for playboys in Yunjing City to study. What are you waiting for? Let's go in." Chapter 241. In the school. Su Li and Ling Li sat in front of the teacher's desk and crossed their legs. They sat face to face and didn't speak. After a while, the atmosphere in the room became quite strange. Even Ling Mo couldn't stand it. He quietly retreated to the door and stood with Wu Bin. Wu Bin peeped at the room from time to time. He was also confused and had a slight headache. Did the little bastard of the Ling family pester the miss? Su Li looked calm. She took out a book from under the table and looked down. But her mind was not on the book. She clearly refused him yesterday. Ling Li was full of arrogance. He shouldn't appear in front of her. But why did he come to her the next day? Was there any misunderstanding? Su Li finally forgot that Ling Li still had everything in this life. He was not the lonely person who could only rely on her in the previous life. Lecturer Su, don't forget about me, your student, if you only focus on reading. Ling Li's voice came. Su Li looked up and her eyes were calm. Her clear and emotionless voice sounded in the room. The affiliated school of the National Academy teaches a lot of things. There has never been a rule. I don't know much. What do you want to learn? Ling Li raised his eyebrows and thought quickly. Then he smiled and replied naturally, Lecturer Su, you don't have to be modest. You are famous for your talent and learning. I will follow whatever you want to teach me. Su Li was a little annoyed. If he really gave an answer, she could simply say that she was not good at it. Then she could drive Ling Li away. But she was forced into a dead end by Ling Li's words. He was the sect master of a great sect. Was he really going to shamelessly stay here and not leave? Wu Bin was also dumbfounded at the door. The miss even lost in the verbal confrontation. The playboy of the Ling family didn't seem to be so useless. By the way, the affiliated school of the National Academy is also an institution. It is impossible that there is no residence. I am going to follow the teachings of my family and study hard. Lecturer Su, please arrange a residence for me. Wu Bin's eyes were wide open. This rascal even wanted to live with the miss. He turned his head and saw Ling Mo standing at the door like a javelin. He looked at the gate of the affiliated school of the National Academy expressionlessly without looking back. Ling Mo couldn't help but sigh. It was a pity that such a loyal servant followed Ling Li. Wu Bin didn't see that Ling Mo's mouth twitched at the moment when he turned his head. Why didn't he realize that the young master could be so thick-skinned? Of course, Su Li didn't want Ling Li to live here. Otherwise, she would never have a peaceful day. More importantly, she was afraid that she couldn't help but expose herself. Therefore, she simply asked Wu Bin to call Dongfang Rui. When Dongfang Rui heard that Wu Bin didn't finish his words, he couldn't help but go to the affiliated school of the National Academy to drive them away. But Qiu Meng also appeared in time. One of them was the prince of the Dahan country, and the other was the wife of the late Lord of North. Their identities were almost the same. As soon as they met, they argued with each other. You and I know the origin of the affiliated school of the National Academy better than anyone else. Its former owner was you, the first disciple of the imperial preceptor. Now it is my daughter. She is the owner of the affiliated school of the National Academy. Lord Rui, the National Academy is the National Academy. It's not wrong for Ling Li to live here, right? Madam Meng, no matter whether what you said is in line with the rules or not, I can't agree. Su Li is my daughter. How important is her innocence? If your son really lives in the affiliated school of the National Academy, how will people in Yunjing City think of her? Dongfang Rui was angry. His face was strangely red because of the quarrel. So was Qiu Meng. Hearing the last sentence, Qiu Meng was silent. After a long time, she nodded and said, what the Lord of Lord Rui's mansion said is reasonable. I didn't consider it carefully. I promise Ling Li that he won't live in the affiliated school of the National Academy. But Ling Li can't go to the National Academy. He can only come here to study. I hope your daughter can take care of him and help him change his ways. As a son and a daughter, I think you can understand. Of course. Qiu Meng finally agreed. Lord Rui immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Ling Ping was still in the imperial court of the Ling family. He didn't want to be enemies with the Ling mansion unless he had to. But let Ling Li change his ways. Damn it. Everyone knew Sima Zhao's intention. How could he not know what was in Ling Li's mind? What was more annoying was that Qiu Meng let Ling Li go. She looked at her daughter in a strange way. No. He must strengthen the vigilance. He couldn't let Li be cheated by Ling Li. Qiu Meng sighed in her heart. Su Li was so good. She couldn't wait for Ling Li to marry Su Li immediately. So, she forgot to consider her reputation. Although she took a step back, it was excellent that Ling Li came to the affiliated school of the National Academy to study every day and had more contact with Su Li. The two adults had their own thoughts. After a while, they finally ended the conversation. Ling Li was slightly disappointed, But he also knew that he had reached his limit. He winked at his mother and pushed the wheelchair into the school. Su Li had received the sound transmission from Dongfang Rui. She was a little relieved. When she thought of the idea that her father came up with, she couldn't help but smile. Seeing that everything was settled, Qiumeng left with Dongfang Rui. She didn't know that soon after she left, a large number of people suddenly appeared in the affiliated school of the National Academy. Most of them were famous playboys in Yunjing City, and there were several guards of the Yunhe sect. Ling Li, who wanted to stay with Su Li alone, saw this scene. He was so angry that his face turned green. "Ling Mo!" he shouted. Ling Mo immediately stood in front of the gate and said in a deep voice, "Master is inside. Who dares to disturb him?" These people were more or less punished by Ling Li. At this moment, when they saw Ling Mo, they immediately shrank their necks. But when they thought of the benefits, they still stood up boldly and raised their heads. "What's wrong with child Ling inside? This is not the Ling Mansion, but the affiliated school of the National Academy. Are we qualified to attend the class? Can the Ling family represent the will of Princess Li? Yes. This is the territory of Princess Li. You can't speak here. Show me if you can." A group of playboys smiled mischievously, and their words were more mean than the others. Ling Mo's eyes turned cold. He was about to step forward, but Wu Bin flashed out and stood in front of him. He said with a smile, "Although their tone is wrong, their words are reasonable. If you want to fight, you have to ask my missus' permission." A trace of helplessness flashed in Ling Mo's eyes. He couldn't offend Su Li. After hesitating for a moment, he could only step aside and let them in. When the playboys saw that Ling Mo gave in, they were overjoyed. They found that since they had the support of Lord Rui, they didn't have to complain when they saw Ling Li. "Oh, Third Master Ling, I haven't seen you for a long time. I really miss you. Third Master Ling, I haven't seen you for a long time. I really miss you." These playboys might have been bullied miserably at ordinary times. Now they had a chance to retaliate, so they couldn't bear it. They sat around Ling Li one after another. The seats next to Ling Li were full. Some tall and strong people even stood in front of Ling Li like a human wall. Ling Li couldn't even see Su Li's face. The noise was like a fly buzzing in his ears. Ling Li was gloomy and finally couldn't bear it. Enough. The whole room was suddenly quiet, and everyone stopped subconsciously. The shadow of the first playboy in Yunjing City couldn't be dispelled by Lord Rui's words. "Third Master Ling, this is the affiliated school of the National Academy." Someone cautiously reminded Ling Li and glanced at Su Li from time to time. Ling Li grinned, and his 2 rows of white teeth were frighteningly bright. Su Li knew everything about him. She wouldn't be more evil just because of what he looked like now. "Yes, this is the affiliated school of the National Academy. For the sake of Lecturer Su, I don't want to fight with you." Ling Li glanced at the crowd maliciously and said with an evil smile, "However, I'd like to see how many people can fly home from the affiliated school of the National Academy." As soon as he said that, all the playboys changed their faces immediately. Even a few of them who couldn't bear it were so scared that they ran away. Clatter. Several tall men sitting in front of Ling Li also moved away neatly without a trace. In an instant, there was no one around Ling Li. Except for him sitting in the middle, everyone else sat against the wall. The scene was so funny. Su Li's beautiful face came into view again. Ling Li's anger faded away. He sat in his seat with peace of mind, and the flame of obsession was burning in his eyes. "Yunjing City. No matter where you go, I will follow you. Sincerity can move metal and stone." There was still a long time. If 1 year didn't work, then 10 years, 20 years. "I don't believe that you won't be tempted at all." Ling Li's behavior was too obvious. Not only the playboys in Yunjing City, but also the guards of the Yunjing sect could feel his determination. They were surprised that the third master of the Ling family was so devoted. As soon as the daytime classes were over, everyone left and immediately spread the news in Yunjing City. "The first playboy in the world begins to pursue Princess Li. No way. Ling Li has not hurt enough women. She is the goddess in our hearts. We can't let him succeed. I heard that Ling Li is serious this time." Bullshit. Even if a sow can climb a tree, I don't believe that playboy will be tempted. I heard that Lord Rui also doesn't like the third master of the Ling family. He is recruiting people to go to the affiliated school of the National Academy to make trouble for Ling Li tomorrow. I will go with you. Together. A trend was slowly forming among the young talents in Yunjing City. It could be imagined how grand the affiliated school of the National Academy would be the next day. At this moment, it was dusk. Su Li sat alone in the mechanism additum. She glanced at the red handkerchief on the table and felt bitter. Chapter 242. In the early morning of the next day, Ling Li came to the affiliated school of the National Academy by carriage. He was so angry when he saw the heavy traffic at the gate and the crowded courtyard. Even Ling Mo, who had always been calm, couldn't help twitching his face. Although he and young master had predicted today's situation last night, wasn't this too exaggerated? Third young master Ling is here. Someone saw Ling Li and shouted. Immediately, many people changed their faces and made way for him subconsciously. They were scared. But there were more young talents who hadn't seen Ling Li's means. They still blocked the door and looked at Ling Li provocatively. They had received good education from their families since they were young, and there were many poor children around them who flattered and followed them. They even went all the way to the National Academy because of their good talents. This group of disciples who grew up under the indoctrination of the sages naturally looked down on profligates from the bottom of their hearts. Ling Li couldn't help but release his psychic awareness to scan the school of the National Academy. He saw that Su Li was still sitting in the same place, reading the book attentively. It seemed that she knew nothing about what happened outside. This girl had obviously reached the innate realm and had cultivated her soul sense. How could she not know what was going on outside? Ling Li snorted secretly and thought, "It's so difficult. Don't try to stop me. Go in. If anyone dares to stand in front of me, I'll throw them onto the street." The sound of gnashing teeth came into Ling Mo's ears, and the head of the Shuelo cult, who had the power of life and death, immediately nodded. "Yes, young master." He firmly pushed the wheelchair to the gate of the affiliated school of the National Academy. Within 3 steps, an elegant young man with a fair face stood in front of him. He thought he was elegant and said, "Third young masterling, I have long heard of your name. But Princess Li is precious. You can't." Before he finished his words, the elegant young man was picked up by the neck by Ling Mo in everyone's horrified eyes. He directly turned into a parabola and fell on the street. He was the 3rd scholar in the affiliated school of the National Academy. Maybe he would be the prime minister in the future. This Ling clan's 3rd young master was serious. Lawless. "Ling Li, you are too much. Do you really think we don't dare to hurt you?" A burly man stood in front of the wheelchair. Judging from his physique, he must be from the Institute of Martial Arts. It was Chen Quan, the #1 genius of the Institute of Martial Art. His cultivation had reached the peak of Hutian 9th stage. He also came to stand up for Princess Li. This time, Ling Li will be defeated. Someone in the crowd said in surprise. But as soon as he finished speaking, Chen Quan screamed and flew out of the gate of the affiliated school of the National Academy with the elegant young man. People who didn't know the truth were dumbfounded. Several playboys who had seen Ling Mo's moves showed a mocking expression. "You didn't even know who was around Ling Li. How reckless. I didn't expect that people in the National Academy are not so smart." Tut tut. The Silk Pants and the young geniuses were standing in 2 different directions. At this moment, the Silk Pants were mocking them, causing the young geniuses to glare angrily at them. How could the young masters of the great clans, who were used to being playboys, be scared off by 1 or 2 glances? Naturally, they stared back without showing any weakness and smiled. "Seeing how ignorant you are, this young master will kindly remind you of this." 3rd young master Ling's servants were not simple. I heard that his cultivation talent was enough to be a talent. He was a beggar when he was a child and almost froze to death on the roadside. He was picked up by the young Ling Li who happened to pass by. He grew up with Ling Li and was loyal to 3rd young master Ling since then. For this reason, Someone in the National Academy contacted Ling Mo in private and promised him a lot of benefits. He even wanted to invite him to be the chief disciple of the National Academy. But he was refused by Ling Mo. As the closest servant of third young master Ling, the Ling family treated Ling Mo well. With the accumulation of resources, Ling Mo might have already broken through the inborn realm. How could Chen Quan be his opponent? Ha ha ha, I feel a little cool to see these self-righteous people being defeated. He couldn't even beat a servant. Chen Quan really lived a dog's life. The young geniuses were ridiculed and their faces turned pale. Ling Mo's childhood. It was an old story. They didn't deal with Ling Li, so how could they know? But now the two geniuses representing the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Martial Arts were still lying on the ground. They didn't dare to talk nonsense, for fear that Ling Mo would make them taste the soil if he was unhappy. Then, no one dared to stop Ling Li's wheelchair, but they all followed him to watch the show. They stuck to him like dog-skin plaster and couldn't be driven away. Creak, as soon as the wheelchair was pushed into the affiliated school of the National Academy, Ling Li heard Su Li's sarcastic words before he turned his head to see Su Li. Third young master of the Ling family is really impressive. Ling Li's face darkened slightly, but he returned to normal in an instant. He smiled and said, "You flatter me. Lecturer Su, can we start today's course?" As soon as the words came out, the people who followed to watch the show were suddenly dumbfounded. The ridicule in Su Li's words was obviously too much. Even a fool could hear it. They thought that Ling Li would get angry directly, but they didn't expect that he would accept the praise shamelessly. Was he still the hot-tempered third young master of the Ling family who would destroy the house and make trouble? And he was too cheeky. A group of playboys couldn't help but admire him. They all thought that the third young master of the Ling family was so good at picking up girls. The title of the first playboy in Yunjing City was not for nothing. Su Li was a little annoyed and didn't know how to answer for a moment. They hadn't seen Ling Li for only one day, but he was more cheeky. What medicine did he take recently? Class. She stared at Ling Li fiercely, took out the book and didn't look at Ling Li anymore. Of course, she didn't prepare for the class. Ling Li's knowledge was not less than hers. These playboys and talents in Yunjing City were not worth her time. She just talked about astronomy, geography, zither, chess, calligraphy and painting, or the strange things in the martial arts circle recorded in the ancient books. Even so, all the people present were fascinated. The voice that originally doubted Su Li's title of the first talented girl in Yunjing City disappeared. The accumulation of the previous life and the continuous improvement of this life were not just words. Even Ling Li couldn't help but be shocked by Su Li's knowledge. He had been reborn in this world for 17 years. He had read more than 10 million books and ancient books. After he controlled the Enmore cult, his vision was broader. But he didn't know some things that Su Li said. This was definitely not the knowledge storage that could be obtained by the Qinghe province and the National Book Tower. Even if Qi Xianqing was included, it was unreasonable. He checked Su Li's background. She became literate and read in the past 2 years. The time was too short. He suddenly remembered Su Li's tearful face under the lanterns of the Desu town 2 years ago. He thought of the table of hometown dishes in the yard of the Desu town. Ling Li stared at Su Li, who was talking calmly. His eyes gradually showed complexity and confusion. Su Li, what secrets did you hide? When you were seriously injured and dying, you tried your best to save me. You didn't hesitate to give your first kiss to detoxify me. You didn't hesitate to spend all your property to add a life-saving card for me. You obviously liked me, but when I fell in love with you, you avoided me like a snake or a scorpion. Why? This question was like a circle. It constantly lingered in Ling Li's mind, but he couldn't get the answer. Time passed quickly. The night fell. Ling Li's carriage gradually went away in the vigilant eyes of Wu Bin. Many young talents and playboys also went home, but they couldn't come back to their senses for a long time. They didn't expect that Su Li's course was so interesting. At this moment, everyone had the idea that even if Ling Li didn't come, they would come to the affiliated school of the National Academy to listen to the class. Compared with the old arguments of the pedantic scholars in the National Academy, Su Li's course was 10,000 times more wonderful. I heard that the beggar's chicken of the Baiwei building was also made by Princess Li. I didn't care about it at first, but I have to have a taste today. Let's go together. It's a pity that I heard that Princess Li's adoptive parents are bad. Princess Li is also kind. She hasn't taken back the Baiwei building. It's really uncomfortable to see the money in her pocket flowing into the Su family. I heard that when Princess Li was in the Su family, the first master of the Su family doted on her very much. Su Qingtan is a member of the Supreme Judiciary. Now he goes out to handle affairs. I think Princess Li must wait for him to come back and then make a decision. Heh, you're really well informed. Are you also having designs on the princess? The person who was asked was suddenly horrified. He looked around in horror. When he didn't hear Ling Li's voice, he was relieved and said with fear, "How dare I? Even if there is no Master Ling, I won't be favored by Princess Li. As long as I can see Princess Li happy in this life, I will be satisfied." But the person didn't know that his words had been heard by Ling Li and Su Li. Look, some people's awareness is even worse than this child's. Su Li said lightly. Ling Li, who had maintained a smile, immediately became angry. With his cultivation, he could stay here without being noticed. Although Wu Bin's cultivation was not bad, how could he resist the hierarch of the Enmore cult? Seeing that Su Li didn't call him, he was a little happy in his heart. But he didn't expect that Su Li would taunt him. No wonder his mother said that he had to be shameless to chase a girl. He finally realized the feeling of being snubbed. Tell me, why do you stay here? If you can't tell me the reason, I will let Butler Wu come here. Su Li leaned against the window and fixed her eyes on Ling Li. There was inquiry and faint alienation in her eyes. You got used to it after you said it many times. Just as Su Li was used to vomiting blood, Ling Li quickly got used to being cheeky. He completely ignored the former's alienation. He took out a mask and handed it to Su Li. This is for you. Chapter 243. Dear, let me show you a trick. The disabled young man sitting in the wheelchair was neat and tidy. Although he was only wearing coarse linen clothes, he still showed an extraordinary temperament. At this moment, facing the ugly woman whose half-face was ruined, he smiled gently and brightly, and even hid the unerasable grey between his eyebrows for a moment. The ugly woman stopped her work and turned her head to look. She saw that the young man turned over one hand, and a mask appeared in his palm out of thin air. It was as white as bone and as jade. The delicate patterns flashed a warm light under the dim oil lamp. Husband, this, the woman was surprised, and then she became flustered. She quickly got up and pressed down the disabled young man's hands. She whispered, "Husband, did you steal it from somewhere?" The mask was so delicate that it must be expensive. It was difficult for their family to eat, let alone buy such an item. The disabled young man laughed, and a touch of sadness flashed in his eyes. "Don't worry. The owner of this thing has always been your husband. I will teach you how to use it. This thing can isolate the psychic awareness and has many uses. But for you, as long as it can temporarily cover the injury on your face, it is enough. When our child is born, I will make a plaster to cure your face." The young man slightly pursed his lips. When he thought that his wife was pregnant, but still had to walk on the street with a humiliated face to support the family, he couldn't help but clench his fists. In the next moment, his clenched hands were gently held by his wife. A moving smile appeared on her ugly face. She said, "Husband, I don't care. It's my honor to have you as my companion in this life." Under the dim oil lamp, the disabled young man stared at his wife's rough and ugly face. His clenched hands gradually loosened, and his eyes gradually became blurred. A man would not easily shed tears until he was sad. His sins could not be washed away in the next life. "Why did I meet you at this moment, Li? Su Li. Su Li." The shout came from far away, and her shoulders were shaken. Su Li suddenly came to her senses. Her eyes gradually focused, and a pair of slightly anxious faces came into her eyes, which was only a finger's distance from her. Her slightly red eyes shrank, and her breath was slightly stagnant. She subconsciously stepped back a few steps and knocked over the tea table behind her. Crash! The teacup shattered on the floor. Seeing that Su Li was scared, Ling Li found that he was too close to her. He couldn't help but be a little stiff. Now he was less important in Su Li's heart. Don't be afraid. I didn't do it on purpose. Ling Li tried to comfort her, but he was also confused. In his impression, Su Li should not be so timid. Miss, what happened to you? Mammy Li hurriedly went upstairs and was shocked when she saw Ling Li, who had changed his clothes. Didn't he leave? Why was he still here? Originally, her impression of the third master of the Ling family was that he was a scourge and the type that Miss could never get in touch with. But when she saw Ling Li's face that day, the more she looked at him, the more familiar she felt. Then she suddenly remembered that he was the young man that Miss had saved and treated in the yard in the valley. The same face, different temperament, but definitely the same person. The Ling family's third young master had a hidden identity just like Miss. Mammy Li suddenly realized and was secretly happy. It seemed that Master Ling Li and Miss were a good match. Unfortunately, only she knew a little about their identities. It doesn't matter. I just knocked over the teacup. Clean it up later. Su Li saw Wu Bin, who was going to come downstairs. She quickly stopped Wu Bin's figure. Perhaps even Su Li herself didn't realize what such a natural action meant. She clearly knew that as long as Wu Bin came in, Ling Li would definitely have to leave. In this way, she could communicate with Ling Li less and expose herself. But she stopped Wu Bin. She subconsciously didn't want Ling Li to leave. Yes, Miss Mammy Li glanced at Ling Li and left with a smile. Su Li took a breath slightly. She walked forward a few steps and walked to Ling Li. She gently took the mask that he still kept in the posture of handing over. Aren't you afraid that your identity will be exposed by giving me such a mask? Ling Li couldn't help laughing. He shook his head and said, I don't need to expose myself in front of you. This thing is the secret treasure of the Enmore cult, just like my mask. With it, even mortals can be isolated from the detection of seniors of the longevity realm. It also has the effect of disguise. I will teach you a pithy formula, and you can master it. Then Ling Li pointed between Su Li's eyebrows and passed the pithy formula to her. But he felt pity. It was a pity that his cultivation was not enough to suppress the old people of the Enmore cult. With the unique mental method of the hierarch of the Enmore cult, the mask could be refined into the body and carried with him. It was the best magic treasure to save his life. In the Desu town, he relied on the mask to disguise himself and escaped all the way. Otherwise, it was impossible for him to escape with his original appearance when a killer of a branch chased him. Su Li lowered her eyebrows and reached out to touch the pattern on the mask. Then she returned it to him and said, This thing is precious. I can't take it. Ling Li frowned slightly, but he soon stretched out his eyebrows. He put the mask on the tea table that he helped up and smiled carelessly. It's just an ordinary secret treasure. There are many of them in the Enmore cult. You have helped me so much. Don't you want to accept a small gift from me? Su Li pursed her lips slightly. If there were many secret treasures, why did he hide this thing in his body when he had nothing in the previous life? Well, as you wish, I accept it. The night wind blew and the clothes of the two people on the roof fluttered. Master, that is the yin face jade bone. It is a pair with your mask. The elders want to keep it for the future Madam Hierarch. You, just give it away. Ling Mo thought of Su Li's reluctant expression and suddenly felt depressed. Ling Li smiled and said helplessly, Didn't you see that she was unwilling to accept it? If she can, it's best if she is willing to be the Madam Hierarch. If not, I will always wait for her. When I break through to immortal level, do you think those old things who are about to be buried can still control my thoughts? Of course not. Ling Mo lowered his head and firmly said, You are the leader of the Enmore cult. Ling Li narrowed his eyes and didn't dwell on this topic. He looked at the busy night market and was silent for a moment. Finally, he said, How is the investigation of the Wanjian sect going? The news from the elders' pavilion said that the Wanjian sect was in chaos and the young head ran away. Those people who came to Yunjing were already looking for the young head. Ling Li sneered and said, Have you ever seen the subordinates who are looking for the young head with murderous intent? Ling Mo was shocked and said, Master, you mean, it's better for the Wanjian sect to be busy with its own affairs. The Enmore cult also needs to continue to cultivate and strengthen. However, the Dongfang family should have a connection with the Wanjian sect. Ling Li looked serious. It was more dangerous than he thought to find the murderer for his father. In the affiliated school of the National Academy. After Ling Li left, Su Li came to the underground adytum with the mask. She glanced at the poisonous mother-child insect which was still slowly wriggling in the bottle. Then she looked back at the mask. After many twists and turns, the mask returned to her hand. Taking a deep breath, Su Li's lips squirmed and she murmured. The jadebone mask immediately glowed and became brighter and brighter. Finally, it melted into a ball of jade-colored water and flowed into Su Li's body through the pores of her palm. A slightly hot flow passed through her tendons and meridians. Su Li closed her eyes and looked inside her pubic region. As expected, she saw the pocket-sized version of the mask lying quietly in the center of the pubic region. She naturally knew how to refine it into her body. Although she didn't practice the mental method of the Enmore cult in her previous life, Ling Li forced her to recite those obscure articles hundreds and thousands of times. Those words had already become an inseparable part of her soul. At that time, although she didn't understand Ling Li's intention, she obediently took a lot of time to review and recite every day. Until she encountered a disaster later and got the Ghost Valley meditation direction in the brothel of the military, she realized that Ling Li had predicted the future. She regarded those secret methods as the seeds of revenge. The crazy price was not killing the enemy with his own hands, but killing Dongfang Rui by mistake and regretting to death. Tick, Su Li slightly bowed her head. It turned out that her nails pinched into her palm unconsciously. Drops of red blood dripped down along the lines of her palm. In silence, she slowly got up and walked to the table. She picked up the glass bottle containing the poisonous child mother insect. The blood flowed into the bottle. The poisonous child mother insect was immediately stimulated. Its surface seemed to be corroded and there was a burst of light smoke. Su Li, you are just a malicious ghost coming for revenge. Even if you accept the mask, you can only take it to hell. You can't waver anymore. At the same time when Su Li's blood flowed into the glass bottle, far away in the frontier, Zhu Yang, with bruises all over her body and numb expression, climbed up the city wall with difficulty with stones that were much heavier than her. Her eyes were dark, just like Su Li who had lost hope in the previous life. After leaving Yunjing City, she wanted to reveal Su Li's true face to the public. Even if she knew that no one believed what she said, it would be good if she could talk about it. However, Su Li, the devil, didn't even give her such a poor chance. She was mute. On the first day when she became mute, Zhu Yang howled miserably, but she was repeatedly beaten by the officers and soldiers. After being tormented a few times, she learned her lesson and stopped making a fuss. However, her body started to ache faintly from time to time. Moreover, along with the passage of time, the pain became more and more unbearable, and it tortured her to the point that she couldn't sleep at night. Retribution. Dragging the stone to the city wall, Zhu Yang laughed silently and burst into tears. This was not the retribution from heaven. It was the retribution from Arya, the girl who was tortured by her since childhood. Arya's retribution was more ferocious than any scourge or beast. Suddenly, a burning pain began from her back and slowly spread. Ah 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 ah. A blood-curdling scream came from her mouth, and the stone in her hand fell to the ground. It fell directly onto the city wall and almost hit the overseer. The supervisor was so scared that his face turned pale. When he looked up and saw Zhu Yang on the city wall, he couldn't help but scold and went upstairs while waving his whip. Crazy woman, you are courting death. Ah 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 ah. Zhu Yang scratched her whole body in horror, and soon her skin was scratched. The blood flowed along the skin, which was hideous and terrible. The supervisor was shocked and took a few steps back. This woman in front of him couldn't have really gone crazy, right? Help me. Something is burning me. Help me. Ah 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 ah. Zhu Yang kept screaming, but she became mute. No one could understand what she meant. More and more people gathered around to watch the fun. Several supervisors also came over. They all looked at Zhu Yang and pointed at her in a circle. Is she bewitched? I think it's quite like. As soon as the words came out, everyone unconsciously shrank their necks, as if there was a cold wind blowing past their ears. Don't talk nonsense, or you will lose your head. Ah 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 ah. Ah 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 ah. In such a miserable scream and the indifferent discussion of the onlookers, Zhu Yang scratched herself to death, and the blood flowed on the ground. Seeing that she finally died, the onlookers suddenly dispersed, as if nothing had happened. Chapter 244. In the underground adytum of the affiliated school of the National Academy. The poisonous mother-child insect in the glass bottle was already soaked in the pool of blood and motionless. She had finally taken the first step. Su Li stared at it in a daze. It was so easy to end Zhu Yang's life in this life, which made her feel extremely unreal. Maybe when she let Su Zipei go to hell, she wouldn't feel much better. She knew there was no answer, but she still couldn't help thinking about it and couldn't help being confused. When she finished all the revenge and helped Ling Li to accomplish the important things, where was her way back? After a few days, it was the eve of the new year. It was snowing lightly. Every family was decorated with lanterns and colored banners. They were busy with a table of reunion dinner. They were full of joy when they saw the sky full of white. Auspicious snow indicated a bumper harvest. The next year would be much better. This day was also the day of ancestor worship. Dongfang Rui changed his solemn clothes early in the morning and entered the palace to participate in the sacrificial ceremony of the Dongfang family. Su Li went to the yard in the Osmanthus forest with Wu Bin. After rebuking everyone, Su Li knelt in front of the tombstone alone. She added the yellow paper in her hand to the fire. The sky was full of flying ashes and white snow. Mom, I don't know that I have come back for the third year. Su Li smiled lightly, and there was warmth in her eyes. It seemed that it was not a tombstone in front of her, but a living person. Compared with the previous life, I am much better in this life. I can come to your tomb to talk to you and I didn't hurt my father. The only thing that bothers me is Ling Li. I never thought that one day, he would take the initiative to pursue me. I never thought that after I refused him again and again, he just smiled and continued to work hard. He never said that he would give up. I don't want to see his increasingly disappointed face anymore. Mom, what should I do? If you know it in the afterlife, give me a hint. Su Li took a deep breath and took out a copper coin from the purse. She held it in her hand and whispered, if the literal is the best, then you want me to let go of everything and let nature take its course. If the literal is the worst, then let me continue to be stubborn. Ding! The copper coin flew into the air. Su Li looked up and saw nothing but the wind with fine snow. The copper coin was also blown down and fell off the cliff. Su Li squinted her eyes and stamped on the ground. She turned into a fallen leaf and fell into the cliff. In the Osmanthus forest full of withered branches, everything was barren. Su Li walked quietly in the forest and stepped on the dead branches and rotten leaves, which creaked to show her sincerity. She didn't use her psychic awareness to lock the copper coins, but only looked for them with her eyes. However, with her innate realm's keen eyesight, even if she didn't use her psychic sense, she could still quickly find the copper coins that fell on the thick branches. That was, Su Li flew to pick up the copper coins and opened her palm. Big letter, Tong, treasure, literally upwards. Su Li's nervous face suddenly relaxed, as if she had won a battle with a strong enemy. She took a long sigh of relief and stopped struggling between right and wrong. Thank you, Mother. In the ancestral temple of the Ling family, Ms. Jiyu stood in front of the memorial tablet with burning incense in her hand. Behind her, Qiu Meng, Ling Ping, Ling Li and Ling Qinglan were all in the room. They went forward to kneel down in turn. Even Ling Li knelt down from the wheelchair with the help of Ling Qinglan. He knelt down 3 times and kowtowed 9 times. After the ceremony, Ms. Jiyu inserted the burning incense into the incense burner and sighed with loneliness. She said, Meng, go with them and leave me alone. Yes, Mother. Qiu Meng put away the faint sadness in her eyes and left the ancestral temple with everyone. Every year on the eve of the Lunar New Year, It was not a happy event for the Ling family. There was only sadness for the relatives. Ms. Jiu personally saw off her husband, son, and grandson. No one knew how she felt. It stopped snowing, and the yard was covered with white snow. The snow fell on the branches like blooming white flowers, which was really beautiful. Ling Ping pushed Ling Li's wheelchair and walked in the yard. His experienced eyes were full of pain and longing. He tried to speak in a calm tone. "Brother Li, do you remember the eldest brother?" Ling Li was slightly stunned, and a handsome and generous young man flashed in front of him. He immediately nodded gently and grinned. "Of course I remember. Second brother, although I was young at that time, I had a good memory. At that year, the eldest brother was 17 and the second brother was 12. He was only 8 years old. The age of the eldest brother was fixed forever. At that year, he met the old guy of the Enmore cult and took over the Enmore cult. From then on, he protected the second brother from being harmed by villains. It has been 8 years. Time flies so fast." Ling Ping grabbed the snow on the roadside and made it into a ball. He was smiling, but his voice was dry. He said, "When we were young, the eldest brother was the most naughty. Every year, he secretly took us here to have a snowball fight. If we were found out by our father, we would be punished with bamboo shoots. But the eldest brother didn't change his ways. We followed him every time and enjoyed it." Ling Li was silent. He came with the memory. Every time he was taken to have a snowball fight by the eldest brother, he was disdainful. But he didn't expect that the memory at that time became a beautiful memory that could only be remembered now. Brother Li, the second brother, is incompetent. Ling Ping suddenly knelt down and sobbed. Everyone in the Ling family knew that there was something wrong, but no one dared to investigate further. He wanted to trace the clues several times and encountered several crises of life and death. Every time, the force that secretly protected him saved him and warned him that he was not powerful enough and should not act rashly. He was still too weak. Second brother, Ling Li's expression was complicated. He stretched out his hands and gently hugged the general who was crying like a child. He said in a gentle tone, "Second brother, compared with me, you are very powerful. You support the Ling family alone. Without you, the Ling family has long been gone." It was snowing again, and the scene was quiet. Chiu Meng, who hid outside the courtyard, covered her face. Her nose was sour, but she didn't cry. She was the hostess of the Ling family. She should be stronger than anyone else. At the round table, there was laughter. It seemed that the sadness was gone. After dinner, Ling Qinglan said that he would stay for a night. After going back to the courtyard and walking around, he left the Ling house with a basket of paper money. "Master, do you want to follow him?" Ling Mo immediately came to report. Ling Li shook his head slightly and drank a mouthful of Liehua spirits. He looked slightly tipsy and said, "No, I know who he is going to see." It was dark at night. At this moment, every family had fallen asleep, but there was still a light on the desolate grave. In front of a tombstone made of marble, there was a table of sumptuous dishes and wine. At this moment, the wine and dishes were cold, but the people didn't leave. Chen Gong leaned against the tombstone and stroked the surface, just like stroking the cheek of his lover. He spent every year's reunion night like this. "Jun, soon. Wait for me for a moment, and I will come to you right away." Ling Qinglan heard the low male voice. Ling Qinglan shook his head slightly and walked to the tombstone. He added a handful of paper money to the dying fire. Chapter 245. Chen Gong looked up at Ling Qinglan and was not surprised. As early as before, Ling Qinglan had contacted him with his real identity. After a few months, Chen Gong was no longer shocked. After that, although they contacted each other secretly, they had no chance to communicate face to face because of their positions. "You come at the right time. I have a bottle of wine left. Drink with me." Chen Gong looked at Ling Qinglan. Under the flickering firelight, he showed a very shallow smile. Ling Qinglan put down a stack of paper money and showed the wine jar in his left hand. He smiled and said, "The first-class Liehua spirits of the Linli building. Have a taste." Chen Gong was surprised and said, A jar of first-class Liehua spirits of 100,000 taels. Ling Qinglan nodded slightly and sat next to Chen Gong. He opened the clay seal with one palm, and the strong fragrance of wine spread. In fact, the price of first-class Liehua spirits was more than 100,000 taels. Businessmen who couldn't buy the original Liehua spirits bought first-class Liehua spirits. The transaction price of each jar was nearly 1 million taels. If Mr. Li didn't give face to the Enmore cult, he couldn't get the wine at the original price. Chen Gong drank a cup of wine suspiciously. He felt that the spicy wine passed through his intestines like a raging fire. It was really refreshing. Good wine, Chen Gong exclaimed and then said in a low voice, the Liehua spirits of the Linli building really deserve their reputation. But, the financial situation of the Ling family has always been very tight. Even if you want to express something to me, you shouldn't let Madame Meng bear it. Ling Qinglan's eyes flashed and his tone was still relaxed. Lord Chen, you don't need to test me. I can tell you directly that there is another force behind me. It's very easy for me to take out 100,000 taels. If you are willing to tell me the details of the extermination of the Yi family, you will definitely gain a lot. Sure enough, you work for the third prince. Chen Gong's eyes were vigilant and complicated. The Ling family secretly adopted you and concealed your identity. But it is a fact that the Ling family has declined these years. Without the help of the third prince, how can you be in charge of the supreme judiciary at such a young age? No, Lord Chen, you are wrong. Ling Qinglan smiled slightly. Chen Gong was slightly stunned and asked, am I wrong? Indeed, even the third prince thinks that it is because of him that I can get to where I am today. But the fact is often more complicated than the imagination. Lord Chen. Chen Gong frowned slightly and couldn't help asking, who is the person behind you? Lord Chen, you don't need to know the person behind me. You only need to know that he has nothing to do with the royal family of the Dahan country. It is a wise choice to cooperate with me to investigate the real murderer. Ling Qinglan's eyes flashed with hatred. He said in a low voice, Lord Chen, don't you want to avenge your wife? Chen Gong was silent for a long time. Looking at Ling Qinglan's eyes which were so similar to his, he finally nodded and said, Yi Mo, I believe you once. I hope you won't let me down. Ling Qinglan nodded gently and breathed a sigh of relief. Chen Gong had kept the secret for many years and didn't believe anyone. This time, Chen Gong finally opened his heart and let him speak. 14 years ago, I was just an ordinary doctor in the Ministry of Justice. Chen Gong said and glanced at Ling Qinglan who was calm. He said, the Yi family opened the secret door overnight, which shocked the whole city. The Ministry of Penalty was ordered to collect the corpses for investigation. I also went there at that time. Ling Qinglan clenched his hands unconsciously and a vague picture flashed through his mind. At the time of the tragedy, he only remembered his mother's mournful scream, as well as a blurry black shadow striking his left chest. After that, all that was left in his consciousness was an endless chill. He stared at Chen Gong's face and asked in a low voice, did you find anything at that time? Everyone was killed by one blow, even General Yi. It seemed that Chen Gong recalled the tragedy at that time. There was deep doubt and horror in his eyes. He said, General Yi was the most powerful deputy of General Ling at that time. His cultivation reached the inborn 8th hurdle. Who on earth could kill him with one blow? He didn't have time to protect anyone to escape. The longevity realm. Ling Qinglan narrowed his eyes slightly and thought of the mysterious man beside Mr. Li a few days ago. If it was a senior in such a realm, it was absolutely possible for him to destroy the Yi family overnight. Although I was shocked at that time, I still kept my reason. After some investigation, I found a lot of doubts. Later, Cheng Jun had an accident, so I didn't have the mood to care about anything. Chen Gong sighed with a dignified look. He turned his head and looked directly at Ling Qinglan. He said, I haven't told anyone what I'm going to say next for 14 years. You should listen carefully. Ling Qinglan was slightly shocked and subconsciously lowered his voice. I'd like to hear the details. First of all, after the murderer destroyed the Yi family, he should be ready to burn the corpses to destroy the evidence. The wall was full of firewood and kerosene. But I don't know why he was delayed and left directly. So, I could see the first scene of the crime. Ling Qinglan was slightly afraid. If the murderer really set the fire, he couldn't survive. Then Chen Gong laughed at himself and said, later, the fire couldn't be avoided. It burned in the Ministry of Penalty. If I didn't sneak out because of my wife, I was afraid that I would have died in the fire. Second, the identity of the murderer. Chen Gong gently touched the tombstone and said, at that time, I stole my wife's body back home. The expression on my wife's face was not fear, but confusion. Over the years, I have been thinking that maybe the real identity of the murderer was someone my wife knew. My wife must have seen what happened in the Yi family at that time, so she was killed. But I secretly investigated all the people who knew my wife over the years, but no one matched. If a senior of the longevity realm really wanted to hide his real cultivation, how could Lord Chen see through him? Ling Qinglan shook his head and said. When it came to the understanding of the martial arts circle and the spiritual circle, he was several times more thorough than Chen Gong. Maybe you're right, Chen Gong said with a wry smile, but even if it is true, I can't go deeper to investigate anything. So, my attention was soon transferred to the third doubt, the Minister of the Ministry of Penalty, Prime Minister Tang. Prime Minister Tang was the Minister of the Ministry of Penalty. Ling Qinglan's pupils shrank slightly, and he thought of a lot in an instant. Yes, Chen Gong said coldly, at that time, a lot of news was regarded as a scandal by the royal family and was tightly blocked. The Ministry of Penalty was burned down. Prime Minister Tang was summoned to the palace, but he was not severely punished. Zhuo Qian was suddenly transferred to Yunjing a few years later. He was promoted all the way and became the most important person in the De Han dynasty. So, I always have a guess in my heart. Who was the officer of the Supreme Judiciary who was responsible for handling the case at that time? Is it? Ling Qinglan's eyes flashed with a dangerous light, and his heartbeat accelerated slightly. Chen Gong sighed with surprise and said, you guessed right. It was Ma De of the Ma family. Now they are the right-hand men of the emperor, and they have great power in the court. I should have thought of it. In the whole Yunjing city, except for them, who else can do that? Ling Qinglan's face was extremely gloomy. He stood up and was about to leave. What do you want to do? Chen Gong looked gloomy and stopped him. This matter is based on speculation. We can't get any evidence. If you impulsively die, won't you hurt the Ling family? Ling Qinglan trembled slightly. The blood in his eyes faded away, and he became sober. He took several deep breaths and slowly sat down again. He said in a flat tone, you want evidence? It's simple. The senior of the longevity realm has a long life. He must be alive now. We can catch the senior of the longevity realm who practices the cold skill and torture him. Then we can know the truth. Chen Gong sneered and couldn't help but satirize. How can you catch the senior of the longevity realm? He can kill you with one palm. I have my own way. Ling Qinglan took a deep breath, and a huge plan appeared in his mind. He said, Lord Chen, you just need to wait and see how I find out the murderer. Chen Gong looked at Ling Qinglan's slightly gloomy face in surprise and doubt. Why did he have the confidence to fight against such a giant? However, Ling Qinglan's appearance really made Chen Gong feel a little hopeful. If you really have that ability, then I will wait and see. After the third day of the first lunar month, Su Li moved out of the Lord Rui's mansion and returned to the affiliated school of the National Academy in Dongfang Rui's reluctant gaze. Miss, don't you open all these gifts? Mammy Li held the gift boxes in her arms helplessly and couldn't help but ask. At the beginning of the new year, both young talents and playboys in Yunjing City sent a lot of gifts to Su Li. Just by looking at the packaging, Su Li knew that the gifts were very expensive. The reason they used was surprisingly the same, to thank Su Li for her wonderful lessons. As for their purpose, Su Li didn't know. Keep the gifts of the Ling mansion and send the rest to the warehouse. The indifferent voice sounded. Mammy Li raised her head in surprise and saw that Su Li was lowering her head and carefully looking at the blue jade hairpin in her hand. Her eyes were clear and bright. That was old Miss's favorite blue water cloud hairpin. Did the Lord give it to Miss? Mammy Li's eyes were wet. She quickly wiped her tears with her sleeves and went back to find the gifts of the Ling mansion that she put aside separately. She gently put it on the corner of the table and quietly left. This is the token of love that I gave to your mother. She fled to the Qinghe province and pawned it. She probably exchanged it for enough food to raise you. I searched all the pawn shops in the Qinghe province and finally found it. Now I give it to you. Su Li seemed to hear what Dongfang Rui said that night. She slightly narrowed her eyes and smiled. Then she turned around and inserted the hairpin into her black hair in front of the mirror. There was a touch of blue in the thick ink, which was incomparably beautiful. After that, Su Li picked up the gift box on the table and pulled off the ribbon. What was inside was revealed. It was just a piece of calligraphy written on good paper and ink. She could smell the faint fragrance of ink. 16 big characters were written in bold and vigorous calligraphy. They were self-contained. Chapter 246. Honey, do you know that when it comes to poetry, the level of my hometown is much lower than that of the Dahan dynasty? I will read it to you. There was a burst of laughter and helpless dissuasion in the room. Honey, you are drunk. Have a rest. Your husband is known as a good drinker. How much wine is it? Listen to me. The so-called beauty is on the other side of the water. A fair lady is a gentleman's lover. Honey, do you think it's nice? It's nice. Honey, you are really drunk. My wife, your husband is really not drunk. Your husband will prove it to you right now. Miss, why is your face red? Mammy Lee's voice came into her ears. Su Li suddenly came to herself and touched her hot face. She pretended to be calm and went back to the room. But she quickened her pace. I'm going out. Don't let anyone know. I know. Mammy Lee laughed in her heart and quickly responded. She saw Su Li go into the boudoir and pick up a scroll on the table stealthily. She followed Su Yun in her early years, so she could read. Her literary attainments were enough for her to be a teacher in a remote place. At this moment, when she saw the 16 words on the scroll, she couldn't help but be amazed. What a profound calligraphy attainment! What a beautiful sentence! Mammy Lee knew it was extraordinary at a glance. She couldn't put it down immediately. Such a calligraphy treasure must be kept well. It turned out that the third master of the Ling family not only pretended to be disabled, but also pretended to be a playboy. He really hid his talent. While Mammy Lee was surprised, Su Li had changed into a simple dress and was about to leave. Mammy Lee hurriedly shouted, "Miss, can I help you to frame this calligraphy?" Su Li stopped slightly. She didn't turn around, but her voice came from afar. "Whatever." Mammy Lee couldn't help but chuckle. The miss was really the same as the old miss. She obviously liked that man very much, but she stubbornly refused to admit it. Every time Mammy Lee saw Su Li speak sarcastically to the third master of the Ling family, she was worried for the miss. It was all thanks to the young master of the Ling family that he had a heart that was stronger than most people. No matter how young miss rejected him, he was still like a dog skin plaster, stubbornly pestering her. Looking at the young miss's expression, it was obvious that she had been moved. Mammy Lee was very happy when she thought about it. She looked up and down at the calligraphy and painting in her hand. She put it down carefully and turned around to prepare the materials for mounting the calligraphy. Steward Wu, young miss said that she wants to rest for a while. Don't disturb her. At the same time, by the riverside of the former site of the Hongyang house, Ling Li stood by the river and watched the clear river flow, which reflected the jadebone mask on his face. There were no less than 100 followers of the Enmore cult hiding around him. Looking around, there was no pedestrian. Young master, will he really come? Ling Mo wore a black and red robe, and his whole face was covered in a cloak, which made people couldn't see clearly. Even if he didn't emit his breath, his clothes were enough to make people tremble when they saw him in the martial arts circle. The leader of the Blood Tower was obviously the legendary leader of the Blood Tower, but at this moment, the killer of Sholu cult was full of strange feelings. He saw that Ling Li changed his previous plain dressing style and wore red clothes. If he didn't know the situation, he might think that Ling Li was going to get married today. Ling Mo quickly thought of the reason, because the figure of Mr. Li in cyan appeared in his mind. Ling Mo couldn't help but smile. He even cared about the color. Young master was surprisingly naive when talking about private affairs. You ask me, but who should I ask? Ling Li responded angrily. Obviously, he was not in a good mood. His performance these days. Even a stone-hearted person should be melted into molten iron. However, Su Li's heart was made of diamonds, and she didn't waver at all. Ling Mo obediently shut up. He wanted to say that maybe Miss Su Li even threw the gift box directly into the warehouse. How could she know that they were waiting for her here today? However, thinking that young master's temper was rising these days, he consciously didn't say much. In a twinkling of an eye, the sky gradually darkened. Ling Li stood by the river for 6 hours like a sculpture. Slight footsteps suddenly came. Ling Li's eyes were slightly bright, and he suddenly turned his head. His slightly surprised face immediately faded, and he couldn't help but feel disappointed. The person was not Su Li, but a kind old man in a black Taoist robe with a thin face. Third elder. When Ling Mo saw him, he slightly bowed his head to salute. This person was a member of the Elders' Union of the Enmore cult who hadn't come out for a long time. At that time, Ling Li could ascend to the position of hierarch thanks to the help of the first elder and him. The kind old man slightly nodded as a response. He looked at Ling Li and said with a smile, "Hierarch, you have been here for a long time. Are you waiting for someone?" Ling Li slightly frowned and replied in a low voice, "It's a matter of great importance. It's better to act when it is dark. Hierarch, it's a blessing for our holy cult that you are considerate." The third elder said happily and no longer entangled in the previous problem. But he kept a thought in his mind. On the one hand, he came to Yunjing City for the safety of Ling Li, and on the other hand, he came because of the secret message of the holy girl. If Hierarch really ruined the great event of the holy cult because of his love affair, he must stop it before it happened. The sun was setting, and the night shrouded the riverside. Ling Qinglan dressed as a cyan fox and came here directly from the Supreme Judiciary. He stood aside quietly and waited for the opportunity. Today's plan was planned by him, but he didn't expect that Ling Li mobilized so many people. However, after seeing the third elder, he understood that with the help of the longevity realm, they could completely evacuate before the Dongfang family reacted. "Master, it's almost time," Ling Mo reminded him in a low voice. Ling Li suddenly came to his sense. He was full of disappointment and wanted to give orders. Suddenly, a boat came into everyone's sight in the river. The person in the bow was dressed in red gauze and wore a jadebone mask similar to Ling Li's. She floated in front of Ling Li in a blink of an eye. "You!" Ling Li's eyes were filled with surprise. He couldn't help but step forward to hold Su Li's hand. Su Li didn't resist and walked down the boat gently. "Hierarch, you even put this mask," the third elder was shocked. He was one of the most senior elders of the Enmore cult. He knew clearly what this mask represented. "Yes," Ling Li said with certainty. His black hair fluttered without wind. "I'm the hierarch, and I should choose the madam." "Third elder, do you have any objection? The hierarch is the supreme leader of the holy cult." "I, naturally, have no objection." The third elder quickly expressed his opinion, and then hesitated, "But this matter is of great importance. Whether this person has the ability. I'm afraid I have to ask the madam to go to the elders' conference. This matter can be discussed later." "Don't be too hasty," Ling Li said, and his heart was beating fast. His hand holding Su Li was slightly sweaty. He was afraid that Su Li would slap him in the face and leave in the next moment. But Su Li seemed to be a different person when she put on the mask. No matter what Ling Li said, she remained silent. This made Ling Li happy, but he couldn't help but feel worried. Everyone started to take action. Ling Li took Su Li to sit on the hierarch's jade carriage. The gauze curtain fluttered in the night wind, like a fairyland. But the scene inside the gauze curtain was a little embarrassing. Ling Li held the soft as cream and was reluctant to let go. But Su Li was so obedient, which made him a little flustered. After the atmosphere was silent for a moment, he finally couldn't help but transmit the sound in silence. "Are you, really Su Li?" Su Li turned her head, and her eyes flashed through the mask. Ling Li unexpectedly read a little shame and annoyance in her eyes. Do you like to hold other women's hands? The cold words came into Ling Li's ears, and he suddenly broke into a cold sweat. God bless him. Except for Su Li, he had never had skin contact with other women. Even Ling Xian only served tea and never entered his bedroom. Subconsciously, Ling Li held her hand tighter and whispered in Su Li's ear, except for you, no one else. Su Li slightly raised the corner of her mouth. Ling Li glimpsed it, and she immediately giggled. Fortunately, there was a mask to cover her face. Otherwise, if her appearance was seen by the followers, they would doubt whether it was their hierarch who was sitting in the carriage now. Such details naturally couldn't escape the eyes of the third elder. He couldn't help but turn his head and sigh. Hierarch, you should pay attention to your image. I can't stand it. Ling Li straightened up and couldn't help but laugh out loud. Do you want me to find a good match for you? No, no, no. The third elder shook his head quickly and waved his hand. I'm already half dead. Hierarch, you don't need to worry about me. While talking and laughing, the atmosphere was much relaxed, and Ling Li secretly breathed a sigh of relief. If the third elder also denied Su Li, things would be troublesome. He admitted that he was a little selfish. He didn't want to give up Su Li and revenge. At this moment, the third elder had other thoughts in his mind. Although he couldn't see the woman's face clearly because of the mask, it didn't prevent him from peeping at her cultivation. If he couldn't see through her, there were only two results. One was that the woman's cultivation broke through the longevity realm and reached the level that he could only look up to. The second possibility was that she was immortal. Even in the spiritual circle, there was no one who broke through the longevity realm. He naturally preferred the latter. It was the most prudent thing for the hierarch to marry a wife. However, the doctrine of the hierarch was unrestrained. Even if Ling Li married a mortal, he wouldn't have any opinion. However, for the sake of Ling Li, he still hoped that the hierarch could marry a person in the martial arts circle. Otherwise, it would evolve into an irreversible tragedy. In the history of the hierarch, there were some hierarch who married a mortal. But how could a mortal understand the martial arts circle which was bleeding every day? Finally, because of the stupidity of the hierarch's wife, the hierarch almost destroyed the hierarch. If the hierarch hadn't come to his senses, killed his wife by himself, and finally committed suicide in front of the memorial tablets of the hierarch to apologize. All these could only be described as tragic. Hierarch, you have read the ancient books of the hierarch. Why did you jump into the fire pit? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.